Good afternoon. I call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting 100 of the Standing Committee on Industry. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Pursuant to the order of reference of April 24th, the committee is resuming consideration of Bill C-27, an act to enact the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, the Personal Information and Data Protection Act, Tribunal Act, and others. I want to welcome Jean-François Gagné, AI Strategic Advisor. He'll be with us a little bit later and we'll speak. Erica Eiffel, who's a journalist and podcast founder. I think she's here by video conference. We have Adrian Schauer, who is the founder and chief executive officer of Alaya Care.
For making yourself available again today. I know we had some technical difficulties, but the headset looks swell to this afternoon. So thanks for being here again. And thank you, Madam Clerk, for the help as well. We have from Alta ML Inc. Nicole Johnson, co-founder and chief executive officer. From Gladstone AI, Jeremy Harris. And finalement, nous avons Jennifer Quaid.
And finally, we have Jennifer Quaid, Associate Professor and Vice Dean Research, Civil Law Section of the Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa, with Céline Castécona, Full Law Professor at the University of Ottawa's Civil Law Faculty. We have a lot of witnesses. Everyone will have 5 minutes. And I will ask Ms. Eiffel to begin.
Madam Eiffel, the floor is yours.
Hello. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to the Industry and Technology Committee, as well as a lot of their assistants and whoever may also be in the room. I'm here today to talk about Part 3 of Bill C-27 and Act to enact the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, the Personal Information Data and Data Protection Tribunal Act, and the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, and to make consequential related amendments to other acts. So Part 3 is the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. Firstly, there are some issues, some challenges with this bill, especially in accordance with societal effects and public effects. Number one, when this bill was crafted, there was very little public oversight. So there were no public consultations. However, and there are no publicly accessible records accounting for how these meetings were conducted by the government's AI Advisory Council, nor which points were raised. Public consultations are important as they allow a variety of stakeholders to exchange and develop innovative policy that reflects the needs and concerns of affected communities. As I raised in the Globe and Mail, the lack of meaningful public consultation, especially with Black, Indigenous, people of color, trans, and non-binary, economically disadvantaged, disabled, and other equity-deserving populations, is echoed by ADA's failure to acknowledge AI's characteristic of systemic bias, including racism, sexism, and normativity. The second problem with ADA is there is a need for proper public oversight. The proposed artificial intelligence and data designated by the Minister of Innovation, Science, and Industry, and is therefore not independent of the minister and therefore cannot make independent public-facing decisions. Moreover, at the discretion of the minister, the commissioner may be delegated the power, duty, and function to administer and enforce ADA. In other words, the commissioner is not afforded the powers to enforce ADA in an independent manner, as the powers depend on ministers' minister's discretion. And number three is the human rights aspect of ADA. First of all, how it defines harm is so specific, siloed, and individualized that the legislation is effectively toothless. According to this bill, harm means A, physical or psychological harm to an individual, B, damage to an individual's property, or C, economic loss to an individual. That's quite inadequate when talking about systemic harm that goes beyond the individual and affects some communities. As I wrote in the Globe and Mail, while on the surface, the bill seems to include provisions for mitigating harm, as said by Dr. Sava Sahili Singh, a research fellow in surveillance, society, and technology at the University of Ottawa's Center for Law, Technology, and Society. That language focuses only on individual harm. We must recognize the potential harms to broader populations, especially marginalized populations who have been shown to be negatively affected disproportionately by these kinds of systems. Racial bias is also a problem for artificial intelligence systems, especially those used in the criminal justice system. And racial bias is one of the greatest risks. A federal study was done in 2019 in the United States that showed that Asian and African American people were up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white men, depending on the particular algorithm and type of search. Native Americans had the highest false positive rate of all ethnicities, according to the study, which found that systems varied widely in their accuracy. A study from the UK showed that facial recognition technology that the study tested performed the worst when recognizing Black faces, especially Black women's faces. These surveillance activities raise major human rights concerns when there is evidence that Black people are already disproportionately criminalized and targeted by the police. Facial recognition technology also disproportionately affect Black and Indigenous protesters in many ways. From a privacy perspective, algorithmic systems raise issues of construction. And that's because constructing them requires data collection, and processing of vast amounts of personal information, which can be highly invasive. The re-identification of anonymized information, which can occur through the triangulation of data points collected or processed by algorithmic systems, is another prominent privacy risk. There are deleterious impacts or risks stemming from the use of technology concerning people's financial situation or physical and or psychological well-being. The primary issue here is that a significant amount and type of personal information can be gathered that is used to surveil and socially sort or profile individuals and communities, as well as forecast and influence their behavior. Predictive policing does this. So algorithmic systems, in conclusion, can also be used in the public sector context to assess a person's ability to receive social services such as welfare or humanitarian aid, which can result in discriminatory impacts on the basis of socioeconomic status, geographic location, as well as other data points analyzed.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Schauer, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Schauer, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think this will be an interesting perspective side by side with Erica's. So AliCare, that I'm the founder and CEO of, is a home care software company, and we deliver our solutions both to the private sector providers and the public sector health authorities. In the machine learning domain, we have all sorts of risk models we deliver. And one of the things that you can imagine ultimately us building up to is a model which on the basis of an assessment and patient data will help at a population health level determine where the health system's resources get optimally allocated. So in that use case, it's definitely a high impact system. I really like two things about the framework in this bill. One is that you're looking to adhere to international standards, which as a developer of software looking to generate value in our society, we can't have 1,000 fiefdoms. So let me start with a thanks for that. And then the second thing I really appreciate is your segmentation of the actors between the AI developers, the people who generate the AI models, those who develop them into useful products, and those who operate them in public. So I think that's a very useful framework. On the question of bias, I think it raises some interesting questions. And I think we have to be very careful about legislating against bias in the right way. In terms of developing the model, really the only difference between a linear regression that, think of what you might do in Excel and an AI model is the black box aspect. So yes, if you're trying to figure out how to allocate health system resources, you probably don't want to put certain elements of that could be bigoted into your model, because that's not how a society wants to be allocating health resources. But with a machine learning model, you're going to feed it a bunch of data, black box, out comes a prediction or an optimization. And then you can imagine all sorts of biases creeping in. So it might be that a certain identity, left-handed people can actually get by with a bit less home care and still stay out of hospital. And that wouldn't be programmed into the algorithm, but it could certainly be an output of the algorithm. And so I think what we need to be careful of is assigning the right accountability to the right actor in their framework. I think the model developers need to demonstrate a degree of care in terms of the selection of the training data. And to the previous example, the reason, I think I can say this with some certainty, is the reason that facial recognition model doesn't perform as well for indigenous communities is because it just wasn't fed enough training data of that particular group. So when you're developing the AI model, I think you need to take care and demonstrate that you've taken care of having a representative training set that's not biased. When you develop and put into market, let's say, an algorithm, I think providing as much transparency as possible to the people who will use it is definitely something that should be endeavored for. But then the use of that, the output of that algorithm, if you have a representative training set and the right caveats, I think we have to be careful that you don't bring accountability and inappropriate accountability back to the model developers. That's sort of my concern, because otherwise you're going to be pitting usefulness against potential frameworks for bias. And so what I think we have to be careful about with this legislation is to not disproportionately shift societal concerns on how resources should be allocated, or kind of, you name the use case, to the tool developer, and sit them appropriately with the user of the tool. So that's my perspective on the bill.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Schauer. Je passe.
Thank you, Mr. Schauer. Now I will give the floor to Jeremy Harris from Gladstone AI, and then we'll go to Mr. Gagne.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm here on behalf of Gladstone AI, which is an AI safety company that I co-founded, and we collaborate with researchers at all the world's top AI labs, including OpenAI, as well as with partners in the U.S. national security community to develop solutions to pressing problems in advanced AI safety. Now, today's AI systems can write software programs nearly autonomously, and so they can write malware. They can generate voice clones of regular people using just a few seconds of recorded audio, and so they can automate and scale unprecedented identity theft campaigns. They can guide inexperienced users through the process of synthesizing controlled chemical compounds. They can write human-like text and generate photorealistic images that can power and have powered unprecedented and large-scale election interference operations. These capabilities, by the way, have emerged essentially without warning over the last 24 months. So, things have transformed in that time. And in the process, they've invalidated key security assumptions baked into the strategies, policies, and plans of governments around the world. Now, this is going to get worse fast. If current techniques continue to work, then the equation behind AI progress has become dead simple. Money goes in the form of computing power, and IQ points come out. There's no known way to predict what capabilities will emerge as AI systems are scaled up using more computing power. In fact, when OpenAI researchers used an unprecedented amount of computing power to build GPT-4, their latest system, even they had no idea that it would develop the ability to deceive human beings or autonomously uncover cyber exploits, and yet it did. Now, we work with researchers at the world's top AI labs on problems in advanced AI safety, and it's no exaggeration to say that the water cooler conversations in the frontier AI safety community are telling us to expect AI systems to be capable of carrying out catastrophic malware attacks and supporting bioweapon design, among many other alarming capabilities, in the next few years. Our own research suggests this to be a reasonable assessment. Now, beyond weaponization, evidence also suggests that as advanced AI approaches superhuman general capabilities, it may become uncontrollable and display what are known as power-seeking behaviors. These include AIs preventing themselves from being shut off, establishing control over their environment, and even self-improving. Now, today's most advanced AI systems may already be displaying early signs of this behavior. Power-seeking is a well-established risk class. It's backed by empirical and theoretical studies by leading AI researchers published in the world's top AI conferences. Most of the safety researchers I deal with on a day-to-day basis at Frontier Labs consider power-seeking by advanced AI to be a significant source of global catastrophic risk. All of which is to say that if we anchor legislation on the risk profile of current AI systems, we will very likely fail what will turn out to be the single greatest test of technology governance we have ever faced. The challenge Ada must take on is to mitigate risk in a world where, if current trends simply continue, the average Canadian will have access to WMD-like tools, and in which the very development of AI systems may introduce catastrophic risks. Now, by the time Ada comes into force, the year will be 2026. Frontier AI systems will have been scaled hundreds to thousands of times beyond what we see today. I don't know what capabilities will exist. As I mentioned earlier, no one can. But when I talk to Frontier AI researchers, the predictions I hear suggest that WMD scale risk is absolutely on the table on that time horizon. Ada needs to be designed with that level of risk in mind. To rise to this challenge, we believe that Ada should be amended, and our top 3 recommendations are as follows. First, Ada must explicitly ban systems that introduce extreme risks. Because AI systems above a certain level of capability are likely to introduce WMD-level risks, there should exist a capability level, and therefore a level of computing power, above which model development is simply forbidden unless and until developers can prove that their models will not have certain dangerous capabilities. Second, Ada must address open source development of dangerously powerful AI models. In its current form, on my reading, Ada would allow me to train an AI model that can automatically design and execute crippling malware attacks and publish it for anyone to freely download. If it's illegal to publish instructions on how to make bioweapons or nuclear bombs, it should be illegal to publish AI models that can be downloaded and used by anyone to generate those same instructions for a few $100. Finally, Ada should explicitly address the research and development phase of the AI lifecycle. This is really important. From the moment the development process begins, powerful AI models become tempting targets for theft by nation state and other actors. As models gain more capabilities and context awareness during the development process, loss of control and accidents become greater risks as well. Developers should bear responsibility for ensuring the safe development of their systems, as well as safe deployment. Now, Ada is an improvement over the status quo, but it requires significant amendment to meet the full challenge likely to come from near-future AI capabilities. Our full recommendations are included in my written submission, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Professor Quaid, la parole est à vous.
Professor Quaid. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairs, as well as the members of the Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. I'm very pleased to appear again before you, this time on Bill C-27.
With my colleague, Céline Castelrenard, who is online, the University Research Chair in Responsible AI in a Global Context. As one of the preeminent legal experts on artificial intelligence in Canada and in the world, she is very familiar with what is happening elsewhere, particularly in the EU and the US. She also leads a SSHRC-funded research project on AI governance in Canada, of which I am part, which is directed squarely at the question you are grappling with today in considering this bill, which is how to create a system that is consistent with the broad strokes of what major peer jurisdictions are doing, such as Europe and the UK and the US, while nevertheless ensuring that we remain true to our values and to the foundations of our legal and institutional environment. In short, we have to create a bill that's going to work here, and our comments are directed at that, at least my part is, and Professor Castelrenard will speak more specifically about the details of the bill as it relates to regulating artificial intelligence. Our joint message to you is simple. We believe firmly that Bill C-27 is an important and positive step in the process of developing solid governance to encourage and promote responsible AI. Moreover, it is vital and urgent that Canada establish a legal framework to support responsible AI governance. Ethical guidelines have their place, but they are complementary to and not a substitute for hard rules and binding enforceable norms. Our goal is thus to provide you with constructive feedback and recommendations to help ready the bill for enactment. To that end, we have submitted a written brief in English and in French that highlights the areas that we think would benefit from clarification or greater precision prior to enactment. This does not mean that further improvements are not desirable. Indeed, we would say they are. Only that we understand that time is of the essence and we have to focus on what is achievable now, because delay is just not an option. In this opening statement, we will draw your attention to a subset of what we discussed in the brief. I will briefly touch on 4 items before I turn it over to my colleague, Professor Castelrenard. First, it is important to identify who is responsible for what aspects of the development, deployment, and putting on the market of AI systems. This matters for determining liability, especially of organizations and business entities. Done right, it can help enforcers gather evidence and assess facts. Done poorly, it may create structural immunity from accountability by making it impossible to find the evidence needed to prove violations of the law. I would also add that at the moment, the current conception of accountability is based on state action only, and I wonder whether we should consider also private rights of action. It is something that is being explored in other areas, including, I might add, Bill C-59, which has got amendments to the Competition Act. Second, we need to use care in crafting the obligations and duties of those involved in the AI value chain. Regulations should be drafted with a view to what indicators can be used to measure and assess compliance. Especially in the context of regulatory liability and administrative sanctions, courts will look to what regulators demand of industry players as the baseline for deciding what qualifies as due diligence and what can be expected of a reasonably prudent person in the circumstances. While proof of regulatory compliance usually falls on the business who invokes it, it is important that investigators and prosecutors be able to scrutinize claims. This requires metrics and indicators that are independently verifiable and which are based on robust research. In the context of AI, its opacity and the difficulty for outsiders to understand the capability and risks of AI systems makes this even more important, that we establish norms. Third, reporting obligations should be mandatory and not ad hoc. At present, the Act contemplates the power of the AI Data Commissioner to demand information. Ad hoc requests to examine compliance are insufficient. Rather, the default should be regular reporting at regular intervals with standard information requirements. The provision of information allows regulators to gain an understanding of what is happening at the research level and at the deployment and marketing level, at a pace that is incremental, even if one can say that the development of AI is exponential. This builds institutional knowledge and capacity by enabling regulators and enforcers to distinguish between situations that require enforcement and those that do not. And that seems to be the crux of the matter. Everyone wants to know when is it right to intervene and when should we let things evolve. It also allows for organic development of new regulations as new trends and developments occur. I'd be happy to talk about some examples. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Finally, the enforcement and implementation of the AI Act, as well as the continual development of new regulations, must be supported by an independent, robust institutional structure with sufficient resources. The proposed AI Data Commissioner cannot accomplish this on their own. While not a perfect analogy, and I know some people know here I'm a competition expert, I believe the creation of an agency, not unlike the Competition Bureau, would be a model to consider. It's not perfect. The Bureau is a good example because it combines enforcement of all types, criminal, regulatory, administrative, civil, with education, public outreach, policy development, and now digital intelligence. It has a highly specialized workforce trained in relevant disciplines that it needs to draw on in order to discharge its mandate. It also represents Canada's interests in multilateral fora and collaborates actively with peer jurisdictions. So this matters, I think, to have that for AI. I'm now going to turn it over for the remaining time to my colleague, Professor Casté-Renard. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the members and also Professor Quaid for sharing her time with me. I want to provide three general comments. First of all, AI regulation is necessary today for three main reasons. First of all, the importance and scale of current risks that are already well documented. And as has already been said, these are proven to occur. We have individual risks of infringement and future risks, in particular the protection of privacy, the principle of non-discrimination, protection of the presumption of innocence, procedural guarantees of transparency and accountability, particularly in public administration. The rapid deployment of AI systems in all aspects of our professional and personal lives. Right now, there are no controls, and we have seen the lack of prior control with ChatGPT. As well, Canada has invested heavily in a pan-Canadian strategy for business research and innovation, and we now need to consolidate this strategy by providing a context, a framework that applies to obligations throughout the chain of responsibility and accountability. The second general remark that I want to make is that these regulations must be compatible with international law. Canada can't work alone at the international level. There are various initiatives by the OECD, the Council of Europe, of course, the European Union. There needs to be in fact, there is a text that is just about to be adopted into law. Then we have, in the United States, President Biden's executive order and the technical standards of the NIST. My last point is how we undertake this. We think that a risk-based approach that takes into account usage context is appropriate. The definition of risk levels needs to include a maximum level of risk considered unacceptable. We need to focus on high-impact risks that need to be defined by sector of activity, and Minister Champagne introduced amendments a few weeks ago on this. We have more information in our submission on this and the criteria that could be used. The targeted risks must include individual and collective risks, cultural, democratic process, for example. I would add that it is vital that we have a compliance approach for the highest risk AI systems. the approach needs to be compatible with the European approach. Right now, the bill's scope is too limited because it concentrates on the private sector. We need to include the public sector. We need to work with the provinces to work with their areas of jurisdiction. So thank you for your attention and our ability to compare. Thank you, Mr. Gagné. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon. I am a consultant, strategic consultant in AI. I have spent my career using these technologies since the 2000s. I'm a researcher in applied technologies and AI. In 2016, I've created Element AI, and it was acquired by ServiceNow in 2021. I have been involved in a number of companies. I worked on the commercialization of GPAI, a global partnership. I was the only Canadian that participated in the high-level expert group on AI in Europe to shape the EU AI Act and to have a trustworthy AI environment in Europe as well. I have been involved in the OECD and the IEEE. I've been involved internationally in other ways as well. I would like to provide a perspective here to say that despite the fact that Canada is involved in research on AI and has made a significant contribution in fundamental research, we are losing that leadership role. We have to be aware of that. We are no longer at the forefront. Our researchers have limited resources now for their research, and it is extremely expensive now to understand what is going on the advanced edge, and there are many researchers and their work that they do. All of that has to be in collaboration with other researchers, and they're doing that with people outside Canada. They are carrying out tests and so on and getting their ideas outside the country. Our environment has always been somewhat less productive than that of the U.S., and the situation is not getting better. Things were better in the past. When we think about such a fundamental technology as artificial intelligence, which I would compare with energy, we're talking about intelligence, know-how, technology that's already being used in all spheres of industry. There is no part of society that isn't impacted by this technology. One thing I really want to emphasize for the committee is that we have to make sure that we don't deal with this as a separate, standalone subject. For example, I can give the analogy with types of energy, gas and energy and so on. We can't look at artificial intelligence as being the same in different contexts. It's very complex, and when we look at all of the aspects, it's a bit overwhelming. Too often we hear in the media And we've already heard here fear, uncertainty about the future, and all these types of terms. But if we come back to what we're concerned with here, yes, we do have to act urgently. I certainly agree on that. But we have to keep in mind what we are actually dealing with. This is a situation that is evolving quickly and affects every aspect of society. We have to have trying to have a simple one-size-fits-all approach. Well, what will happen? Maybe we will protect ourselves, but we will certainly eliminate opportunities to develop our economy and to enrich our country. That's a fact. We can't, it wouldn't be otherwise. It's just too complex of an issue. But if we can, if we can't be precise, we will have broad regulations, and if things are too vague, you know that we won't have the investments that we want. If we don't know what the consequences would be, if things are going to be defined later, are not clear, then companies will just invest elsewhere. And in technology that is so digital and so mobile, then it's easy to move this technology south of the border, for example. And this happens in our companies, in our universities, and we have to be aware of that. So these are vital aspects to take into consideration. How are we going to set up these rules? How are we going to define them and allow ourselves to have clear regulations that are precise enough, but that also give impetus to investment? Because when people invest, they like to know what they're going to get out the other end. They want that transparency. They want to be able to publish and to invest in a way that means that if they have clear rules, they can choose to invest in Canada or provide their services here or not. They will have to decide whether the requirements are too strict or things aren't clear. Otherwise, companies will just go elsewhere. I have a whole list. I'm sorry I wasn't able to provide all the details and specific recommendations beforehand, but I will do that. One thing is clear, just in conclusion, I want to mention that I believe that in this context, in order to have an environment where we have trust, transparency is extremely important. We have to ensure that users of this technology are aware that they are interacting with this kind of technology. There are issues that will be cross-cutting, and the basic principles, therefore, that is declaring what services are involved, what are the parameters. If the services change and there are updates, then there has to be an analysis of the impacts and the use of the technologies. And then we have to make sure that people aren't manipulated and that privacy is protected. These are fundamental aspects of what we need for framework regulation. But one of my main concerns really is the lack of precision. Just drawing from my experience in Europe with the AI Act, it is that they wanted a very broad broadly based piece of legislation, and the challenge was to work with industry that wanted something that wasn't that broad. They wanted specific rules. There's always a new situation. We have generative AI, then we will have a new generation. The technology is going to apply to health and all other aspects. There will always be something new and something that needs to be amended or changed. So, in my opinion, we need to be prudent, we need to be surgical, and work with all sectors, all industries in developing specific regulations for the automobile industry and other industries. Thank you. That concludes our presentations by our witnesses. So we will begin with Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes. Mr. Généreux. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Harris, I felt I was in a film where we had parliamentarians studying a bill on artificial intelligence, and you came and said the Third World War is about to be declared. And I would like to swear, but unfortunately I'm not allowed. So the greatest frustration that I have, and others too, is to have this legislation that has a whole number of elements, but the three in particular, we've got the privacy legislation, the tribunal, and then AI. And all of this information that we're getting today really should be about a standalone piece of legislation. We are examining this bill and this aspect on AI. Since the beginning of our study of the bill, there have been important advancements. We know that in England, there was a meeting about a voluntary code. Ms. Quaid, you talked about this law, and Mr. Gagné as well, that is about to be adopted in Europe tomorrow. You talked about your involvement in that. Are we talking about the same thing there, or are there more than one? Or Mr. Gagné or Ms. Renard? My colleague is the expert in European law. Mr. Gagné, so this law that would be adopted, I'm not quite sure what Mr. Gagné took part in. I think it was some of the preparatory work to develop the regulations for the European Union. But what I was talking about were proposed regulations that were introduced in 2021 and then were adopted by the Council of Europe in December 2022 and then by the European Parliament in June of 2022. So there are three partners on this, and they have to agree on the wording. So since summer, since September in particular, there's this three-way discussion, and tomorrow there is a very important meeting that may lead to a political agreement on the wording and the text, which has to be adopted by the elections that will come up in June 2024. Oh, okay, thank you. So if the agreement among the three is to be adopted, it has to be before June 2024. Now, Mr. Gagné and Mr. Harris as well, everybody is aware of the speed with which artificial intelligence is developing, research and development is going on all the time. So is the bill that we have here before us in Canada, Ms. Castellana talked about the amendments that the minister introduced, that we still haven't seen the wording and we don't know exactly what they will be. How do you see this bill in the context of what's being done elsewhere in the world? Ms. Castellana or Mr. Gagne? I think if we compare ourselves with Europe, this bill is fairly similar in its approach because we're dealing with a bill that wants to address artificial intelligence and so we can look at the scope of the approach. But I just, as I mentioned, want to focus on the number of people that would be involved. I think in Britain they have 80 people working full-time on this. And this just shows the scope of the issue. So our approach is similar to what is being done in Europe. I think that we need the resources in Canada to spread this work out. When we talk about self-driving cars, that's artificial intelligence. All of these sectors need to think about the impact on privacy, whether we're talking about cars, how are we going to deal with the risks, how are we going to certify whether this should be done or not, how are we going to collaborate, what should be the rules of the game. I've got to give you that example, but I could give you many more. So we need to have principles and the concept. There are very basic principles like the protection of privacy. All that you have worked on in the other parts of the bill are valid, but why is this a specific area? Because this is as general purpose.
I'd just like to say that you don't need to oppose regulation to general regulation. I think that there's a danger that things could get mixed up, when in fact what you really need to do is look at what's on the table, which is a general act, but that doesn't mean that provinces can't legislate in their areas as well. This is something that affects every sector. So, of course, there will be a need for more targeted laws in certain areas, but that should not exclude a more general framework. We are already behind, and Europe is going in that direction already. They have general regulation. They have sectoral regulations with respect to transport. And about the United Kingdom, they declined to have an act on this. They have a voluntary framework, and that is something that should be avoided. We need rules, and you have to start somewhere. But they signed, didn't they? We signed that agreement, didn't we? Yes, but a voluntary agreement doesn't have the same teeth. I don't want to necessarily get into it. If you look at how a voluntary code affects a company versus a binding one, I can certainly go on at length about that. Thank you very much, Mr. Quaid. Before giving the floor to Mr. Turnbull, just to clarify, the amendments with respect to AI were made public last week, and so they are accessible and they were circulated to the committee. Mr. Turnbull, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. This is a very challenging topic for even the smartest of legislators. I really value your expertise, all of you, that you bring to this conversation. It's really helping inform our discussions. Professor Quaid, you had said in your opening remarks that, and I wrote it down, delay is not an option. Use the words vital and urgent. It sort of sounded like right now in Canada, AI development and regulations around it, it's a bit of a Wild West in terms of anything goes. Can you speak to the urgency that you spoke to and just stress that a little bit more?
I think the urgency comes from the fact that for a long time there has basically been an unregulated sphere, and perhaps everyone was a little bit asleep at how quickly things evolved. But I think now we are late. I mean, everyone is late. And I can't speak to the specificity of the development of the technology. I am not a scientist of artificial intelligence, but I do know a thing or two about law and about business law. And I can tell you that if you want businesses to modulate their behavior as a function of the public interest, you need legislation. The profit motive and the structure of our corporate law is extremely permissive. They will not make the choices you want to make. We have to make those choices, or rather you, as the representatives of Canadians, have to make those choices. What is most important? You put that down. That doesn't mean we don't fine-tune. That doesn't mean we don't adapt. But we have to start laying some rules down, because right now what's driving the choices is self-interest, and mostly that's economic.
Thanks. It's sort of one of the, sometimes we talk about perfection being the enemy of the good. It seems like this is one of those situations where we need to get legislation passed in order to have something which, of course, as Mr. Harris has pointed out, at the rapid pace of evolution of AI development, that we're going to need to probably continue to update. Would you agree with that, Ms. Quaid?
Yes, and I would say that there are some examples of other areas, other sectors that evolve very rapidly and that we have lots of experience regulating. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We do need to be creative. We need to be more agile. We need to be prepared to bring new elements into the regulatory process. And I think there are lots of smart people who've got great ideas to help you with that. But I don't think we can stop by saying, it's new, we don't know what to do. I think the time for that is long gone. We need to move forward, and it's not perfect. I will never say that it's perfect. No law is perfect, but it is perfectible or improvable, and we need to start somewhere.
Thank you. And Ms. Quaid, I'm going to go to you again. You mentioned something called structural immunity as being a risk in your opening remarks, I think. I didn't quite I understand the concept itself, but I'd like to have an example of where that might be a real risk for us in terms of our work moving forward and how we might be able to avoid that.
So I'm coming at this with my corporate criminal liability hat, and this statute is primarily criminal law. That was one of the astonishing things when I first read this bill. And relying on criminal enforcement comes with some costs in terms of how you prepare evidence and put things together. And so what I'm concerned about is that when we don't have transparency about who's involved with what decisions in relation to this technology, and I can't speak to how it's actually done. I think the experts here can say something about that. But what we need to insist on is transparency about who does what, because you cannot convict a corporation or an organization in this country without knowing who did what and knowing what their status is and what their decision-making power is in the organization. I direct you to Section 2 of the Criminal Code if you want to read it. And even in the case of regulatory liability, where an employee can engage the liability of the organization, you don't need to have a status-based association that they're a senior officer. You still need to know who did what. Otherwise, you have no evidence. So I think it's really important to make sure we create a regime that forces the information out so that then we can assess. That doesn't mean we're going to convict all the time or we're going to prosecute all the time. But if everything is hidden, then this is just window decoration. You will never, ever get a prosecution or even administrative liability, in my view.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful testimony. Mr. Harris, I wanted to ask you a question similar to Mr. Generou. I similarly had the experience of listening to you and feeling like I was in a horror movie or a sci-fi novel or some intersection of both of those when I heard you talk. I know that you're bringing up these risks and potential harms as a very real thing, so I don't want to take that lightly, but it is quite scary to hear. I want to ask you kind of a bit of an ethical or philosophical question, which is, you had talked about mitigating the risks. You had talked about, I think, just a blanket ban on certain types or explicitly forbidding certain types of AI or advanced AI systems. One of the questions that occurs to me is when we're dealing with essentially advanced AI is surpassing human intelligence, I think is what I'm hearing. You talked about the superhuman and the power-seeking behaviors as being a real risk. I'm sort of interested in, how do we develop an ethical and or legal framework? I think this is kind of a core challenge in this work that I'm grappling with, which is, like, a lot of our ethical and legal concepts rely on things like reasonably foreseeable futures. They rely on concepts of duty, et cetera, most of which rely on humans' ability to look at what the outcomes might be, given our past experience. And I think a lot of that, and you had talked about how some of our national security assumptions have been invalidated. Are some of our ethical assumptions and legal assumptions being invalidated by the advancement of AI? And how do human beings create a system or a set of guidelines for something that is actually beyond our intelligence? That's a tough question.
These are excellent questions. I think, fortunately, we're not without tools dealing with them. So to piggyback off the testimony that Jennifer just gave here, I think that's actually quite right to say, how can we massage this into a form that fits within our legal frameworks? We're not going to overhaul the Constitution tomorrow. It's not going to happen, right? One of the things we can do is recognize the fact that we can't predict the capabilities of systems at the next level of scale. And so safety by design would seem to imply, okay, until we can, so we're not talking about blanket ban, we're saying until we can, let's incentivize the private sector to make fundamental advances in the science of AI, to give us a scientific theory for predicting the emergence of these dangerous capabilities. I'd also say we can draw inspiration from the White House executive order that came out recently. One of the key things that they do, again, to piggyback off this idea of bring it all, like sunlight is the best disinfectant, bring this all out into the forest so we can evaluate what's going on. There is a reporting requirement in the executive order. If you train an AI system that uses above a certain amount of computational power in the training process, you need to report the result of various audits you've performed, various evaluations. These evaluations have to do with bioweapon design capability, chemical synthesis ability, self-replication ability. That's all baked into the executive order. So seeing something like that, where we have a tiered process that essentially mirrors what we see in the EO, where we go based on computational processing power thresholds. Above this line, you got to do this. Above that line, you got to do that sort of thing.
That's very helpful. How much time do I have?
It's an interesting line of questioning, Mr. Turnbull. You can continue a little bit.
Oh, thank you. You're very generous. So I guess, is it really that computational power which is the key predictor of how an advanced AI system will evolve, and therefore, at least correlates with the level of risk? Because I'm sort of reluctant to think it's that simple, but perhaps that's what you said. Am I accurate?
No, you're quite right to be reluctant to think it's that simple. It is that's the single best indicator that we have right now. A couple things can factor into this too. So you can make breakthroughs at the theoretical level, the algorithmic level, that effectively means that you can squeeze more juice out of the lemon. For the same amount of computational power, you can do more. And that's precisely why you want to offload whatever that computational power threshold is. You want to offload that to regulators to determine what that is. Don't enshrine that into law, because it will change quickly. So that's one piece. To the question of what other capabilities might emerge from these systems, well, it also depends on the training data. So if you train these systems on biosequence data, they will learn for less computational power how to make a bioweapon, and that's enshrined as well in the executive order. There's a lower threshold for those sorts of technologies.
Thanks, Chair. I can end there, but I see Mr. Gagnon wants to maybe make a comment. Maybe we could allow him that, and then we can move on.
Just a quick reaction here. Latest progress in science have demonstrated techniques where you could invest significant amount of money in compute inference. So that's not training. To be able to have models of a certain size perform like they were 10 times bigger. So it's never that simple. So yes, it is a proxy model size, but there's ways with sufficient money or sufficient compute where you can go further than model size. There's way to go around that and get performance out of these models. There's also ways to specialize smaller models. So it's again, I think it's a use case based approach that can potentially offer an opportunity to mitigate the risk. I think the use cases mentioned are absolutely relevant, but the triggers, I think, are never that simple.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Lemire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses. First of all, Mr. Harris, I remember when you came on the Hill, provide an educational presentation to legislators on artificial intelligence. I think that you, in your remarks, talked about the when you were talking about the potential, if you wanted to get to Toronto as quickly as possible, well, artificial intelligence would be suggesting just to clear the road of everything, and you could go as fast as you could. And you also had that picture of the Parliament buildings on fire that was created with artificial intelligence. I think that was your presentation, right? Yes. I want to come back to you, but I'll first go to Mr. Gagné. I was listening to you and wondering, well, we agree on parts 1 and 2 that aren't as urgent, but as the wording stands in the bill, are we on the wrong path given the rapid developments? Should we stop and go back to the drawing board on this bill, or should we try to make the changes needed and adopt this legislation? I agree that there is urgency to have basic legislation, and we need a basis. You know better than I do how the process works, how long it would take to go back to the drawing board. I think it might take a lot of time. So I think that we need a version that has a good solid basis, that works in most cases, and that is precise. That is the main thing. But the danger is that if there are additional now, I'm glad that it was specified that they were, in fact, introduced, contrary to what was said earlier, because I read them in the train. When we talk about the high-risk AI systems, that includes so many applications that I wonder why it is a separate category. If we want to be specific and precise and to have a high level of transparency, when we look at how much infrastructure is needed to comply with these regulations, then we need to be very clear. If we know what we want in the area of the media or elsewhere, then we have to have more precision rather than leaving this broad and leaving a lot of room for interpretation. And this may cost a lot of money for companies that are trying to develop, for example, health products. If they have to raise capital to create a huge apparatus to be able to comply. So you need to be very clear and precise. Thank you. For the last few months, I've been following artificial intelligence quite closely. And yes, I understand that we were leaders in this area, but are less so now. I'm looking at what is happening in other countries. Maybe we need to choose the right locomotive rather than creating the train ourselves. I know there are cultural differences as well. As a Quebecer, I want to look at the future of our smart technologies. We need to also look at what we're calling on industry to do. We are creating legislation to deal with criminals, but are criminals really going to be regulated by this? Can we really regulate the bad actors? Well, when we look at the U.S., we can certainly see criminal actions in the services that they're willing to provide. We can try to have perfect legislation that is beyond any criticism and so on, but that will certainly slow down the development of technologies by Canadian companies. And already we're falling behind, and we will fall further behind. And we can't really able to impose that much. We have actors that we can hold accountable for their actions. So if we can put a framework around that and some parameters, then that can work. But if we are too general, too broad in our approach, then we will squelch the innovativeness of our companies because they won't have confidence in the regulatory framework. In the international dynamic, in the United States, we have this presidential order, the executive order. And so is that the right way to go? Or do you think what's been done in Britain, the voluntary code, is that sufficient? Where do you think we should look if we want to find a good model? These are valid reference points. A great deal of work has been done internationally to understand what is at stake. I have read the bill and the amendments, and there are a lot of valid aspects. I could point at aspects. Oh, yeah, here for health, there is wording. I could point out what is useful, but if we apply this to all industries and at every side, we have to really balance things and adjust our measures to make sure that in a given sector we protect people, but that we allow for innovation. That's my real concern. I read this from an entrepreneurial perspective, and already it's not easy to innovate and to develop services and things. If it costs even more to do that, well, I think I've run out of time for now. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Ms. Eiffel, if I could go to you. One of the things that I had a chance to do this summer was attend some conferences in the United States, and they had some of the larger players that are developing artificial intelligence. And they had identified what you spoke about is that in their modeling that they're doing now, a lot of biases currently exist. Could you speak more to that in terms of how it can actually, I guess, stream people and stream ideas if we don't have the right people building artificial intelligent models in the first place that reflect more of society versus models that aren't inclusive?
Well, there are many ways that this could materialize into something that is not beneficial for some groups. So, for example, predictive policing is one way that we see artificial intelligence being used to actually predict criminal activity. But the data that is the training data that's used is historical. So if you're using historical or certain types of data to train the AI system, you're going to get a compounded effect where those neighborhoods that are over policed become even more policed. Another way it comes about is hiring. So hiring agencies use AI or have used AI to search for executives for executive positions. Unfortunately, a lot of that data is also historical, which means that there's a bias against women because traditionally women haven't held those positions. So, like, these are very real consequences that are at scale. And I think the scale and the scale and the speed at which this could happen is very concerning. I believe the Edmonton police recently had used you, you have to excuse me here. Had used a system to predict the they'd use DNA to predict the facial features of one of the suspects of sexual assault. And what they came up with was a 14-year-old Black boy. And like, that's the other thing. This adultification of Black boys is another way that AI manipulates what we see and what we consider as victims, as perpetrators, and anything like that. So I think what the problem is that it has to do a lot with the training data, but the systems themselves, I'm not sure if the right questions have been asked or the right assumptions have been made to create the model itself.
Yeah. And I appreciate that, and we haven't talked about as much of that. Mr. Shore wants to get in here, please. I might have mispronounced your name, but please go ahead. I think this is an important subject that we haven't really delved too much into because the modeling
for me,
is
that
critical.
Would be an
Please go ahead
argument
there.
in support of Monsieur Gagnier's proposition, which is to legislate in the domain in which the model is used. I think there should be, in this specific example, in law enforcement, you have to take care not to do predictive policing that's biased. To say that the legislation should live at the model level could lead to very either adverse effects of that legislation in a totally unrelated domain like healthcare or in transport with a self-driving car model. So I think it's hard to say that we can find a legislation so perfect at the level of the underlying technology to cover the use cases in all of these different domains. So that would be my reflection on.
Thank you. And Ms. Castetz-Renard, please.
Merci de me donner la parole.
Thank you. If I may, with respect to Bill C-27, there is an approach that differentiates the sectors, and they won't all be subject to the same measures. And we know through Minister Champagne's amendments that there are these distinctions. So I don't think it's fair to say that there is a one-size-fits-all approach here. Perhaps the bill doesn't go far enough, but we can't really say that this bill lacks precision because there are these different provisions. We can have a general approach with a broad application, but then we can have sectoral also precision like they do in Europe. I also want to say with respect to Britain, Canada signed a political agreement. It's a very general text that is not binding, and so it certainly doesn't prevent Canada from setting up its own regulation. And the U.S. took its step just before the day before, in fact, before the British measures were brought in. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Time left?
You don't, but I see Madame Eiffel has her hand up and Mr. Harris here as well, so we'll take both interventions before we go to Mr. Viss.
Thank you. I do have an issue with us not providing accountability for these harms that haven't really been laid out properly. I also have a problem with the accountability, the little accountability we have in the bill today, and that is a commissioner that really doesn't have any sort of public responsibility. And so, yes, we can say we don't want to legislate this or we don't want to legislate that, but we know the harms are here now. And I don't want a big swath of Canadians to be part of those unintended consequences when we know what the consequences can be.
Mr. Harris.
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back to this notion of, do you regulate the model or do you regulate the end applications? Because I think that is pretty central here. I think we're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. There are risks that irreducibly come from the model, right? Look at OpenAI's ChatGPT, for example. They build this one system, one model, and I don't know if I can. In fact, I know that I can't. I know that no one technically can count the full range of end-use applications that a tool like that would have. You use it in healthcare today, you'll use it in space exploration tomorrow and software engineering the day after. The idea that we're going to be able to take a general purpose model like this and regulate it as if somehow we can play this losing game of whack-a-mole, like this is just not going to track reality, unfortunately. This is true for a certain subset of models, of risks, the more extreme ones. When we look at the risks, for example, from general purpose models that can orient themselves in the world, have high context awareness, right? So you got to regulate the model at that point because that is the source of the risk irreducibly. For other things, yes, we need to have application level regulation and legislation. That's, again, you see that in the executive order. We're doing both things. But I just want to surface that, it might seem like there's a tension between these two approaches, but I think they're actually not at all incompatible. In fact, in some ways, deeply complementary. Just wanted to park the thought.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Viss. La parole est à vous.
Mr. Viss, you have the floor. Mr. Gagné, you said in your testimony that we need legislation that can keep up with the evolution of our technology. Does the department have the capacity to meet that challenge and keep up with technological change? It's difficult to imagine that it would be the case.
Actually, I'm going to go, Madame Quaid. You mentioned a model where we adopt the Competition Bureau for artificial intelligence. You're the first person to raise that suggestion during our testimony. Can you just expand a bit on that and what it would look like in practical terms, maybe in 1 minute or less?
You've given me a challenge. I'll do my best. The idea is the following. I'm not saying that we absolutely imitate the Competition Bureau. There are some things that we could make differently. But the kind of legislation that is imagined here has some similarities with the kind of legislation that is in the Competition Act. That is to say, they are responsible for a whole array of responses, true criminal, regulatory, administrative, and civil. And there is a specialized tribunal with that. We don't need to talk about that right now. But I think that the point is they have developed an expertise. They have a permanent staff, large, divided into directorates. They've developed a digital intelligence agency. So those things, support what I think other witnesses have been skeptical about, which is the capacity to actually deliver on this. The U.S. has basically not made a secret of it. They've just said, let's use our strong antitrust institutions, while we wait to create something else. And so in some ways, we would be consistent with what's being done there. The other thing I really want to insist on, sorry, it's an extra 10 seconds, is that having an agency headed by an independent commissioner will allow Canada to participate in the international arena. That is how you get around these enforceability problems. You know, you have to work with your friends. We might only target in Canada local things, but we need to work with allies. That you need a player at the table for that.
Well, thank you. And it almost reinforces my apprehension expressed in my first question about the capacity within the department. So that's much appreciated. Mr. Harris, you painted a scary model in the beginning, but what do we have to look forward to with AI? I don't think it's all bad.
No, you're quite right. And that's part of the paradox here, right? Like, we're talking about intelligence, as was highlighted earlier. This is like the most general purpose thing humans have, maybe the most general purpose tool ever. Right.
I'm going to ask me. Just out of curiosity. So, you know, the Abbotsford Hospital has a cancer treatment center, and I'm thinking, what role will artificial intelligence play in the treatment of cancer in the next 20 years? I can't imagine under any scenario we're doing it the same way as we are today because of this technology.
So, to land the plane, kind of give you concrete timelines here. When you talk to folks in the frontier labs, the median, totally reasonable supposition they'll give is, yeah, I think it could be anywhere from 2 to 5 years to reach human-level AI across the board. Now, if we take that, let's say there's a 30%, let's say they're completely off. Like, that kind of estimate, the amount of change that's implied in that, in areas like healthcare, but not just healthcare. I mean, material design, we've just had Google DeepMind come out with a paper where they made essentially 800 years of progress in material science in a couple months, right? So there's huge potential here.
I kind of liken it when I was in university over 20 years ago now. I can't believe it. We learned about the impact of the Gutenberg press. Is the moment we're going through right now even larger than the Gutenberg press?
I think it's, I don't want to be flippant about this. I think it's clearly bigger than that.
Okay.
I think it's, again, the one thing that distinguishes human beings from other species on this planet is the thing that we are right now trying to figure out how to bottle up on a bunch of servers. So, yeah, huge potential, but great power, great responsibility. I've seen Spider-Man as well. You know, this is kind of the. I can quote scripture. This is kind of the. But this is the nature of the technology, and I think that the challenge is, yes, we're going to be facing the strongest economic temptation to take risks with this and to swing for the fences right when the risk is most acute. That's what we keep hearing from these labs, and we see that dynamic play out internally as they compete with each other and race to the bottom.
Finally, if I have one more quick question, I'm like many of us here around this table have children. What do we need to consider for children in respect to AI? Is there anything specific we can be doing on the AI aspect of C27 to ensure that we do whatever we can possible to protect the innocence of kids?
I'm not an expert on child welfare or child psychology, but what I will say is the persuasive abilities of these systems are ratcheting up at insane rates. If you look at OpenAI's GPT-4, they ran evaluations on it. They found out it was able to persuade human beings into solving CAPTCHAs for it, those annoying tests that prove that you're not a robot. Well, it was able to persuade people to do those for it. That's going to, think of the applications for marketing. I think adults and kids are going to belong to the same equivalence class of entities relative to these things. I think it's bad for kids, but I think adults start to look an awful lot more kid-like in the face of highly persuasive reasoning machines like this, essentially.
It's a reason to have an agency. It's a reason to have an agency, and we're already thinking about these questions in the competition context, if I can tell you, about the persuasive use of digital technologies and so on. These things are already happening. So I fully agree that, and the other thing, the pitch I'm going to make is that the Competition Bureau and the Commissioner have a mandate to try to strike this balance between risks associated with concentration and misleading advertising and so on, dominance, and the benefits of economic activity, dynamism, and innovation. And I think you are going to see in certainly certain parts of artificial intelligence that same tension. You need a specialized agency that has the expertise to look at those things and to make proposals. Ultimately, of course, you and government will have to tell us what the values are that are important. But I think it's very analogous. We have models we can use. It's not rocket science, believe it or not.
If I may, I think very concerned about recommender engine in social. Je suis très préoccupé par les
I'm very concerned about the recommendations regarding social media, or the compulsive behaviors, the suggestions made to children. That's a huge concern for me as a parent.
Merci.
Thank you. That's very fascinating. I will now turn to Ms. Lapointe for 5 minutes, and on behalf of the committee, I want to wish her a very happy birthday. You have the floor.
For Ms. Quaid, in May 2022, you appeared before the Public Safety and National Security Committee, and at that time they were performing a study on assessing Canada's security position in relation to Russia. And at that time, you looked... Oh, maybe it's a different
committee.
one.
But anyway, I'll
Okay.
listen to your question.
You had said that cyber threats are becoming more sophisticated and are increasingly pervasive. Is that associated to you?
Maybe that's artificial intelligence imitating me. I am not a cybersecurity expert at all,
Okay.
and I would not venture an opinion in something that I don't feel I have the expertise to comment
That's
on, so it's a
okay.
little surprising. I've been before the industry committee, but no other committee. I've been before the Senate Banking Committee, but not national security. It must be someone else.
I must have the
Yeah.
a different one. So I will ask you a different question then. And this is one around, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts on what role do you see for public awareness and education in building a resilient nation against AI-related threats in Canada?
I think it's crucial. There's no question that education is a fundamental, especially when we're talking about children. I think it's going to be challenging, and I don't want to understate. And once again, I defer to the technical experts who know, what is in the technology. But there is no question that education helps. I'm going to beat my horse in this entire meeting, just using the example, only as an example. The Competition Bureau does a lot of education proactively, a lot to do with misleading advertising. So do all the consumer protection agencies of the provinces. There's quite a good collaboration there. And that's because fraud, and particularly, digital manipulation, is just going through the roof. And so people need to be informed. We're playing catch up. That has been true of the criminal law and the criminal justice system forever. We're not. That's not going to change. But we still have to try, and we still have to keep, as best we can, keeping up with what's going on. I think that the worst thing we can do is say it's because it's too hard, we do nothing. Yeah. And that's why I'm here, and my colleague agrees 100% with me. We have to do something. It's going to be imperfect. We're going to play catch up, but it's important. And you know what? There are a lot of people who can contribute their expertise to developing the tools. I really do believe this is not an impossible task. Hard, but not impossible.
Okay. Mr. Harris, I'd like to ask you the same question.
Pleasure to answer. I mean, so this is actually close to one of the areas that I work on a lot. So, one subset of the work that I do is training for U.S. national security officials, especially kind of more senior and in the defense and national security universe. So one of the challenges with training is, as has been commented now many times, like the space is moving so fast that the training has to somehow be relevant and fresh. There are a few kind of core things that people have to understand, and the public should understand, are the drivers of this technology, of capabilities. Right? This idea, for example, of scaling up AI systems. So we can have a rough sense. If I tell you roughly like how many computations went into building the system, you can have a rough sense like, oh, okay, so that's about like that's a ChatGPT level system. Right? Immediately you have like a comparable you can establish. So there are basic things like that we can do. There are other things. I think this is a solvable problem. We've had a lot of success finding scalable ways of doing this. And anyway, there are a lot of partners to collaborate with to the points that were just made here. I'm optimistic on that front.
And Mr. Harris, earlier we heard Ms. Quaid talk about that need to strike a balance, and she believes a good viable solution around that is the creation of an agency. I would like to ask you how Canada can strike a balance between harnessing the benefits of AI for security while minimizing those associated risks.
Yeah, I think one of the frameworks that I really like is one that's framed around, again, computing power as the kind of barometer that we use to determine the level of general capability of systems. And there are asterisks galore on that, right? Like we heard about, yes, you absolutely can do the technical term is like inference time, augmentations, and you can do all kinds of stuff. But the fundamental capabilities of a base model are limited by the amount of computing power you put into it. So in that sense, when you look at what's being done in the executive order, they're kind of pulling on that thread. They're starting to build institutional capacity for using that as a yardstick. I think that's the best yardstick we have. It's imperfect. And I really wish it were not, but it is the best yardstick that we have for the moment. There's all kinds of stuff that we can do around evaluations and audits depending on what level you are at on that computing power hierarchy. The more computing power you spend to build a model, the more it costs. GPT-4 costs, by our estimates, anywhere from $40 to about $150 million to train, just in computing power alone. So I'm sorry, but if you can afford to train GPT-4, you can afford a little auditing. Right? So that's kind of a nice thing about this yardstick. It maps onto resourcing as well, and we can use that to calibrate the trade-off between risk and reward.
Okay. And from your perspective, how important is it for international collaboration in addressing global security implications of AI?
Hugely. I mean, I think ultimately, partly because of like what's going on in the open source world right now, the problems that Canada generates, the rest of the world gets to eat, and then the problems that the rest of the world generates, Canada gets to eat. We really live in one kind of internet ecosystem. Yeah. And so if we drop the ball, we're letting the world down. And if the world drops the ball, they're letting us down. We can't have a hypocritical system where we turn around to other even adversary countries and say, hey, you ought to do this if we're not doing it ourselves. So I think there's a certain universalism to the situation we find ourselves in.
Ms. Quaid, would you like to add to that as well?
I think this is the central challenge that you need to figure out. We're having the same conversation in competition, actually, about how do we adjust to the digital economy, which is a word I don't like, but the new economy, which has a lot of digital artifacts, and that is there's a lot of experimentation happening internationally. People are trying different things, and part of that is because we have different legal structures and different institutional structures and different cultures. So I think that the balance that has to be struck is there's probably a small number of things that we as a country, and you are the elected representatives who kind of have to make that assessment, that really matter to us as Canadians, that might be unique to us. I mean, Monsieur Lemire evoked, our linguistic identity and, the cultural specificity of Quebec, but there are other things as well that might be really important to us. I think of our Indigenous communities. If those are really important, you have to bake those into your system. And then internationally, what you try to do is you make sure that you're aligned on most of the big things. So you can have a couple of things that are really, really important to us, and maybe we have special rules about that, but you have to have general alignment, because otherwise it doesn't work. The challenge is to make sure that how you take those general agreement principles and translate them into operational legal rules. And I guess I'm a bit of a nuts and bolts lawyer for that kind of thing. Like, we have to be cognizant of the structural and legal limitations of our system. We do exist in a federation, and I just want to make one point about the regulating everything. There is a division of powers, and a lot of regulation has to come from the provinces. Let's be very clear. This bill is centered on interprovincial and international trade and on the criminal law power. That doesn't cover everything, and cooperative federalism is going to be essential. So international cooperation is important, but also we have to agree in the federation.
And where have we seen that done well?
I guess you could ask yourself whether the Europeans have done it. Maybe Céline wants to say something about that, in terms of how well they have navigated the necessity to integrate these considerations. I think the European system already lends itself to this necessity of dialogue. This trilogue is three entities that represent sort of three, the three basic political powers in the European Union, and I'm mangling this. They have to get together and agree. And I think that we might have to imagine something like that. I know no one likes that idea, but I think a conversation has to occur among the provinces and the federal government. It also probably has to involve local communities. I think it's all hands on deck. And so I take the point that we can't regulate everything with one general framework, but we do need a general framework to set things up. There are some out of bounds things. Let's say kids, out of bounds, just period, right? And we can do blanket, prohibitions. We do it, right? It can be done, but you have to target those things. And then for other things, we need to make sure that the patchwork fits together. I'll share one, and then I will stop. I'll share one concern I have, which is that if we are not cooperative in the Federation, what is going to happen? There will be a set of litigation founded on the division of powers, like we had 25 years ago in environmental law, where large economic interests who have the money to do it will say, oh, this isn't federal jurisdiction. And then the provinces enact a law and they say, oh, this isn't provincial jurisdiction. And it will take years to sort out. If there's agreement, you can make sure there are no holes and that Canadians are protected.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Maire.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Castelrenard, I heard you yesterday on Radio Canada while I was traveling to Ottawa, and the subject was very interesting because you were talking about the potential risks with artificial intelligence in various areas like space travel. It might involve the police activity, and there could be effects on the presumption of innocence. So is Canadian legislation sufficiently advanced to prevent those kinds of abuses? Of course, Bill C-27 isn't necessarily the perfect solution, but can we prevent the difficulties and prevent these problems? Well, in Canada and the provinces, the use of facial recognition is freely used, and there aren't any real constraints. We know that with the case of Clavio AI, that facial recognition has been used by police services like the RCMP. Increasingly, it is used. So we know that a legal framework could create concern, but we shouldn't be naive and think that this technology won't be used. Obviously, there are advantages for police investigations. We have to weigh the pros and cons. So facial recognition in an ideal world would have to include principles of honesty and limited usage for specific purposes, for investigations, for example. So perhaps it should only be allowed for authorities for investigations. So that is one of the issues that needs to be addressed, and Bill C-27 isn't connected directly with those practices. It really applies to international and interprovincial trade and not to the public sector. Perhaps companies that are proposing these kinds of systems of facial recognition to police forces could be regulated. So this shows the need for regulation of AI. Ms. Eiffel, I would like to hear your reaction because in your opening remarks, you made quite a striking remark. So could you talk about the possible uses of facial recognition technologies?
One of the problems is that it does tend to misidentify not only racialized people, but non-binary people. There are cases such as, I believe, the self-driving car has a problem with recognizing women. And so when these technologies start to affect larger proportions, or basically a significant proportion of the population, without some sort of accountability measure, we're looking at a very bad fragmentation of society on an economic level, on a social level, and in ways that would fracture our politics. And I think that can be minimized, to be honest. One of the things I would like to see with ADA is it be its own bill. I personally think it should be spun off so that we can look at these things more clearly, because as it stands right now, there is nothing to say, for example, you go for a loan and AI predicts that your loan should be rejected because of a variety of factors, or maybe factors that really aren't attributed to you because of race, gender, class, geographical location, religion, language, all the things. So if we're gonna build these systems, we have to protect people from the negative impacts of those systems, especially when they happen at scale, and especially when they happen with government agencies. And I think one of the problems with this bill is that a lot of government agencies, especially in national security and law enforcement, will be exempt. And those are some of the areas, you think of immigration too, those are some of the areas where you will see large uses of AI. Coming back to, I think, let me just say this about education. And I think a lot of the education over time should have come from journalists and journalism. We should have had a more robust journalistic tech field that could inform all of us and look into these issues with AI and tech writ large.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much. Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Quaid, if this bill doesn't get passed, we have so we'll go to the new year, and then it has to get through the House of Commons. Then it has to go to the Senate. And then if the Senate has any amendments, they have to come back to the House of Commons. So just give us a little bit of your concerns about the delay process, and what is there anything else we can do in between to deal with this? Because even if we have political consensus in the chamber here to move this as quickly as possible, our schedule is such that it won't be to the new year, and probably clause by clause and so forth will take some time, and then we have to send it to the other place. And the other place sometimes it can take some time, and then again an amendment would then have to come back to us in our chamber.
Well, you are the experts of your own procedures. I'm not going to lecture you on how the legislative process should happen. I mean, it's funny, and I will allow myself this small editorial comment. On the one hand, the AI bill has been moving slowly and has sat for a while. I mean, there was an original bill that was proposed. It died on the order paper. There was a new one. And I contrast that with some things like in competition where we're moving at lightning speed. So it seems like it's also a question of establishing priorities. That said, I'm not recommending the budget bill process. Please do not quote me as that. I think it's a terrible thing. On how you could move forward, here are some suggestions without any knowledge of what your procedures are. So I might be saying things that are wrong.
Yeah.
But
that's fair. That's fine.
So
I appreciate that.
I mean, I am a planner, like many busy working mothers, and I'm thinking maybe you can already start checking out, like if you like my idea of creating an agency, for example, just to pick a random one, maybe you would start already looking at what are some possible structures, what's being done elsewhere. Maybe a study can be commissioned. Maybe ICID can already start looking at that. What kind of profiles of skills would you need to populate that? Maybe you can already start looking at some of the challenges that might be involved in the criminal and regulatory enforcement part. And I mean, it's been said before and beaten over the heads of many, but obviously, I think there needs to be more work done on bringing out those, getting an idea of what's going to be in those regulations and thinking about how are we going to create a system where we can have this iterative process of updating the regulations. There are models out there. There are smart people in Canada writing about agile regulation. I think that we can already start lining up what the feasibility of certain solutions are before the bill is enacted. Yes, it might not happen and it might be, effort wasted, but I think there are a lot of researchers who'd be happy to look at these things and who'd be happy to provide you options. That would be my suggestion.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Massé. And speaking of parliamentary procedures, the bells are ringing, and I will need to have unanimous consent, if you will, just to pursue until 5:50, which would be the time our committee would adjourn for this part of the meeting. So do I have unanimous consent to continue? Yes. Amazing. Mr. Fast, the floor is yours.
If I might, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to just get this back to the bill before us. And without prejudging the outcome of Mr. Champagne's proposed amendments, if we assume for the time being that those amendments will be passed and incorporated into ADA, I'd like to know from each of the three of you, Mr. Harris, Ms. Quaid, and Mr. Gagne, do you support ADA going ahead as it is right now? Understanding that in the future it is almost certainly going to be amended, reevaluated, recrafted, may come back in a different form. But the bill before us right now, we have to make a decision on that. If you're here giving us advice, is it your advice for us to go ahead with this, or are there substantive amendments that you would propose?
I can speak for myself, to just begin with. So I think that the bill right now is significantly better than nothing, and one of the key factors for me in evaluating this is just the timeline. Do we want to be confronted in the year 2024, 2025, 2026 with nothing on the books? My strong impulse is to say, no, we must have something. Given the timeline as it's been explained to me by folks who are working on this bill, it seems unlikely that we will have something on the books by then otherwise. That's my understanding. It may be wrong. If that is the case, then the bill in its current form is better than nothing. And that's literally how I'm approaching this. There are things that are actually very good. The general purpose AI system stuff, the cessation of operations components to the bill, I think are really, really good. So I think overall for me, given the current landscape, given the timelines, I would be in favor of the bill going ahead, but I see significant issues with it that I highlighted, including the compute thresholds and all the stuff in my testimony.
I am also of the view, and I can speak for Professor Castelrenard as well on this point, we are of the view that it is better to proceed with this bill. It is improvable. We have identified the things we think that should be improved. I do think, making sure that there's sufficient resources and institutional framework to support the actual implementation of the bill is important. We've got things that we suggest that could improve it and strengthen it, although those are probably at the level of regulations or could be achieved through regulations. And, I think we need to move forward. I would urge this committee to continue to solicit opinions or to pay attention to people who are analyzing for the potential problems. Not because they should defeat the bill, but we should go in with our eyes open to what the potential challenges are. But I definitely come down in favor of we need to move forward. It's already too late.
I will provide a list of recommendations from my perspective about this. I think there's lots of aspects that needs improvement. Some are too broad, others are too harsh. In terms of consequences around certain actions, so personally, my perspective would be to keep working at it.
And not look ahead to the current form of bill.
No.
Right, that's helpful. Were any of the three of you and Ms. Ilfil consulted in the lead up to this bill being drafted? So all three of you, all four of you are coming in after the fact and providing advice.
May I just?
Sure, go ahead, Ms. Ilfil.
this bill didn't have public consultation, and so it seems like a big step that the things that we're talking about now could have been mitigated with with proper consultations. And to me, that's a big red flag about this bill. Secondly, it really has no protection for the public. And I, I, I know that there's sort of like this framework, but even the framework is insufficient. So I would have to agree with the last person who spoke and said, do you really want to push through a bill that has no protection for the public?
Thank you. Mr. Gagne, in your opening remarks, you suggested that Canada is falling behind the rest of the world, certainly the developed world, in addressing the challenges of AI. You went on to also to talk about Canada losing investment in this space. I'd invite you to expand on both of those. They may be related. Maybe we're losing investment because Canada hasn't had either a regulatory framework in place, or we've got taxation challenges or other challenges that scare away investment. Your comments, sir.
There's a multitude of aspects that comes into play when you're going to evaluate if you're going to, for instance, train one of these very large models. One of it is access to data. There's currently certain issues around the copyright law that prevents companies from using text or images, where in the US or in Japan, they can freely use these. And this has been a subject of, it's been pointed in the past. And this is preventing anyone who's training these types of models from training them or operating them from Canada. So what you're seeing is Canadian companies going to the US, driving runs of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of training in the US, not in Canada, because that prevents them from being able to innovate. I'm giving that one as an example, but my concern was that by having an approach that is a blanket approach, there will be pockets of situation like that. What I'm pointing out here is a small thing. It's like, oh, it's just text for this like particular situation, and then boom, Canada is not playing in the large language model game. And there's not going to be any very large machine learning data center built in Canada, not a single one. And these are multi-billion-dollar investments.
Yeah, it's just to share a perspective on like why is it that OpenAI and Google DeepMind and Anthropic are all based in Silicon Valley and there is no Canadian equivalent. So I'm a startup founder veteran. I built all my startups in Silicon Valley. I didn't build them in Canada. I was born and raised here. I've lived here basically the whole time. I moved to Mountain View to build my startups early on, and then I moved back, still based them there. There are some regulatory factors. It's nice to have a Delaware C corporation. Okay, great. But that's not the fundamental reason. The fundamental reason that these companies are based in the Silicon Valley area is just that the best investors in the world are based there. Like, that's it. That is literally, that is the single most important factor by far. Like, when I go to Y Combinator, I hear the actual best advice on startup building on planet Earth. There is no equivalent to Y Combinator. This is the world's best startup accelerator in Canada, full stop. The best investors in Silicon Valley, the Vinod Khoslas, the Sam Altmans, that is why this is happening there. There are at the margins regulatory things going on here, but as a startup founder, again, who's done this multiple times and been faced with this exact decision many times, whether it's with AI or other things, there's a kind of talent delta there in terms of just the best VCs, the best angel investors. That's the ecosystem. Toby Lutke from Shopify, he started his company here in Ottawa, but there's a reason why their cap table is filled with Silicon Valley money. It's because that's where the best investors are. So, like, at the end of the day, it's the same story over and over, and I think we're just seeing it replicated in AI. I don't think there's anything too different there.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Bynen, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The proposed Artificial Intelligence Act does not provide for pre-market conformity assessment of artificial intelligence systems, but Section 15 allows the minister to order an audit. The government's proposed amendments to AIDA includes a series of tasks to be completed before the general purpose or high impact artificial intelligence systems can be made commercially available, including an assessment of adverse effects and a test of the effectiveness of measures to mitigate risk of harm and biased results. What do you think of those new obligations that the government wants to impose on people who do develop the systems? I'll start with Ms. Quaid, and then I'll go to Mr. Harris and Mr. Gagne.
We talk about this a little bit in our written brief, but not in a lot of detail. Now I can draw on a different example, which is securities regulation. I think that these amendments are in the right direction. I made comments in the brief that they probably don't go far enough. And part of the reason why I think they don't is because you really need to build a base of understanding of what's going on in order to be an effective regulator. We see this in other sectors too. So they need to know what's going on and get an understanding. I mean, international finance and capital markets is something that changes constantly, all the time, and we're always playing catch up. They manage, even with 13 regulators in this country, they manage. So I do think that imposing obligations, disclosure obligations, disclosing, or having an audit function is important, but I would make it mandatory and I would make it standard. That is to say, not ad hoc and dependent on having, some inkling of what's going on. In fact, we learn things because we find them out. That's what continuous disclosure in securities regulation is about. It's making sure that we're constantly on top of things. So I think it's in the right direction, but it could be strengthened.
Okay.
I'm just going to echo what she said, really. I think it's what you see, again, in the White House executive order context. There's a reason that everything's being designed around disclosure. Tell us what tests you've run, what the results were, and setting up infrastructure to reveal that and to train regulators to understand the results of those audits.
Mr. Gagne.
I think that's where we got to be prudent. And Canada's a small market. If you impose a cost that is too prohibitive or rules that are very hard to clearly comply to, companies will just elect to not publish their models or give you access to it. Anthropic is not in Canada. There's tons of companies that decide that they're just not going to give you the tools. And then suddenly your entire ecosystem, all your industries can't benefit from the uplift in productivity.
Should Artificial Intelligence Data Act require a compliance audit before the artificial intelligence systems are in place in the market? Start, Mr. Harris.
Yeah, I strongly agree. I think that's essential. So one lens that I'd bring to this is national security. You build these systems, you don't have to deploy them for them to be tempting targets for theft and exfiltration. And I can say from firsthand experience in certain contexts that the labs that are leading the way here are not resourced to withstand a sustained campaign, exfiltration campaign from nation-state attackers. And so just through that lens, as we build more powerful systems, there has to be some level of responsibility prior to deployment. And then there's also the issue of loss of control, which can happen prior to deployment as well. So I would say yes.
Ms. Quaid?
I agree. And to come back to we do have examples elsewhere. We have high-risk industries that exist already. The nuclear industry is one of them. But even in finance, I think I disagree slightly with Mr. Gagne because to the extent the Americans are doing something, they've got the force to insist, and that is the importance of being a player at the international table with an advocate in the form of a commissioner who's truly independent and able to make decisions, because then you can make sure you're on side with everything. I do believe that at the end of the day, international cooperation is essential, but I agree that looking for dangers ahead of time before they're launched on the market should be the case. We insist on that already for other things, in product safety, in other things. So to me, it's not new. We have to adapt it to AI. But the other thing I would add, which is important because sometimes this comes out, is, we can't force companies to share this sensitive information and there's a competitive dynamic. Government departments handle confidential information all the time. That's what they do. The Commissioner of Competition does this all the time. Yes, of course, there's a risk that it gets leaked or whatever, but I don't think that's any higher than other risks. I think that sometimes that's overstated. Government regulators can handle sensitive information and can use it in the public interest. That's why we trust them to do it, I would say.
Mr. Gagne?
If I may,
Go ahead.
je voudrais
I would just like to say that not only is it necessary to have a compliance system for audits before these systems are on the market, but in fact it's necessary for Canadian companies because this is required elsewhere, so we need to prepare our companies in Canada to be able to meet international standards.
Monsieur Van Bijnen.
Thank you, Mr. Van Dynen. I will give Mr. Lemire the chance to ask a last question. I understand that we don't have much time, but I just want to take advantage of the fact to come back to Mr. Gagne's opening remarks. You talked about the need to enable Canadian and Quebec companies to be able to calculate their costs, and that is vital. Well, companies that produce semiconductors, and there is huge growth in that area. That is the main issue. And in fact, many of the startups, and I don't want to give particular names, but those that are really moving forward with AI, I don't see how the economy I don't see how they can do so economically and make their ends meet because the capital involved is huge. So all the access to computational power is important because increased productivity has to be taken into account, and all of everything that goes into that will increase the ability of Canadian companies to compete, and this may make it possible to create more startups. Yes, I agree. I think the right people are listening right now.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lemire. Thank you to all of our witnesses for their enlightening testimony this afternoon on this important legislation. I spoke to Mr. Harris before the meeting. Some of you have provided briefs, but please add any additional information that you would like to on the amendments. So we're going to suspend now before the second part of our meeting. So thank you to all of you.
And thank you to the interpreters, support staff, the analysts, but we'll be back shortly after the vote. So meeting suspended.
So this is the 101st meeting of the Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. Pursuant to the motion adopted on November 7, 2023, the committee is resuming consideration of its study on the STDTC. I'm sorry that we are running late. We had votes at the House. We have with us George Lafont, Strategic Development Advisor. Welcome. And by video conference, Stephen Kukucha, the CEO of Zero Technologies. I think that he is in Vancouver joining us online. And Guy Ouimet, the engineer, Sustainable Development Technology Canada. If you wish, you will each have 5 minutes for your remarks. I'll start with Mr. Lafont.
Chair and honourable committee members for having me here today. I want to begin by acknowledging we are on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of Anishinaabe and Algonquin people. My name is George Lafont. I'm a citizen of the Saskatchewan Muskeg Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory. I currently serve as an advisor to business, educational institutions, social and cultural organizations, and I am known for successfully leading strategic initiatives requiring First Nation engagement. Previously, I served as 2 terms as the Treaty Commissioner of Saskatchewan, the first Treaty Indian to serve in that role. I was appointed by the Harper government in 2012 and then reappointed in 2014. I served as a tribal vice chief, then later as a tribal chief of the Saskatoon Tribal Council, a first among equals, with 7 First Nation chiefs and their diverse First Nation communities. My entire public service has been devoted to supporting reconciliation, wellness, economic development, and innovation for my communities. Improving access and the quality of education for Indigenous youth is what underpins all of my efforts, and this work is informed by my educational background and experiences as a public school teacher some 42 years ago. In the education sector, I served as an advisor to 3 university presidents and also served as a university board of governor. I advised them on how to ensure that Indigenous students are set up for success throughout not only their time in post-secondary education, but also in their future careers. It is this role that I work with the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology, commonly referred now as SIT. It was these public service roles that led me to, in 2012, to be appointed by the Harper government as an expert to examine First Nations education on reserve and bring advice forward to address a new relationship between the federal government and First Nation communities on education. It was there I witnessed the fact that First Nations people are doing well in primary industries, but almost non-existent in the clean tech industry. Since I was appointed to the board of SDTC in 2015, there has been a noticeable change on how this organization has modernized to better meet the needs in the markets and the Canadian clean tech industry. It was paramount to ensure that Indigenous communities were also factored into this equation, to determine how Indigenous peoples were set up with the proper skills and training needed to participate in this critical sector, and also that this sector could respond to the unique needs of our communities. Strides have been made over the last decade, but there's no denying that the clean sector and innovation agenda presents an even steeper hill to climb with a lack of access to training, education for Indigenous youth. Indigenous people are at risk from being excluded from Innovation Canada. We're underrepresented in STEM, with Statistics Canada reporting that the total employment in this industry is less than 2.5% for Indigenous persons with post-secondary training. During my time on the STC board, I had conversations about this very issue with STC management and advised organizations and post-secondary institutions about their obligations that they had to ensure Indigenous youth did not miss out on the future of innovation. In 2020, SIT was approved for funding from STC for a Maker's Lodge, Canada's first innovative accelerator dedicated to educating and empowering grassroots Indigenous entrepreneurs. This pilot project was through the STTC ecosystem funding stream, which encourages innovation collaboration among diverse persons in the private sector and academic and non-for-profit organizations. This is a part of STTC's mandate and is a part of their contribution agreements. I want to be clear. Although I spoke to STC about these important issues coming up to find solutions to ensure Indigenous participation and introduce them to SIT leadership, I was in no way part of the decision-making process for funding the SIT project. When SIT entered conversations with SDTC, I proactively disclosed my conflict and recused myself from any and all discussions moving forward. Following the RCGT report, I was made aware that SIT mistakenly included my services as a part of their expenses under the guidelines of the SDTC project. This was an error. I immediately contacted SIT, who promptly resubmitted their expense claims. I never received a payment from SIT related to this project. My contract with SIT is an advisor to the President and is unrelated to this project. As I've said, I have spent years working in Indigenous education and on improving the outcomes for Indigenous communities. Although I'm an advisor to the SIT, this program has no personal benefit to me. However, it does have potential benefit to thousands of Indigenous youths, giving them an opportunity to combine traditional knowledge with a new idea and contributing to the innovation landscape of Canada. As the committee does its study, I do not want this important work to be lost. It is important the creation of this innovation programs like this, Innovation Accelerator, that we help mentor Indigenous leaders and entrepreneurs, and to ensure that not just middle-class communities can benefit, but all Canadians can both benefit from a meaningful and contribution to a modern Canadian economy. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I'll now yield the floor to Mr. Kukusha for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and honorable members. My name is Stephen Kukucha, and I've served on the SDTC board since February of 2021. I live in Vancouver. I'm a retired lawyer, and I'm certified by the Institute of Corporate Directors. SDTC's work is critical to the development and success of Canada's clean tech ecosystem. I believe my unique perspective and positions within the clean tech sector bring value to my role on the board. With over 20 plus years of experience in clean tech, it provides me an understanding of the challenges companies face in acquiring capital. That struggle has been exacerbated by the market downturn in late 2021, the dramatic increase in U.S. government investment in this space, and now the pause in SDTC's work. Whatever happens because of these hearings or other investigations, it's critical to state the important and unique role that SDTC plays and the organization's mandate has for Canada. I ask this committee to consider its importance to all the fledgling companies it supports. As well as my work in clean tech, I should also disclose that I've been involved in politics in the past, both federally and in British Columbia. And I'm very proud of that involvement. I believe engagement in our country's democratic process, no matter what party one supports, is important to civil society. For example, I have a profound respect for all of your decisions to run for office and seek careers in public service. It's one of the more important things a Canadian can do. I'd also like to disclose that I was the recipient of the whistleblower call to the board. I'd like to put that on the record. Unknown to me, our call was surreptitiously recorded. However, I'm comfortable tabling a transcript to show the level of professionalism this individual was afforded in good faith. On multiple occasions, the whistleblower was asked to share their dossier and the facts they were basing their allegations on, so that the board could respond and address them in a professional manner. Unfortunately, they did not. After my 1-hour conversation with this individual, I quickly realized the board needed to be informed, legal counsel engaged, and a proper process followed. An immediate investigation was commenced without informing the individuals that were the subject of the allegations. I acted in good faith, followed proper governance, and in my opinion, the board undertook its fiduciary duty. Regarding my investments in clean tech companies, any and all conflicts I had were disclosed prior to my appointment. In fact, I was asked to resign from the board of a company that had previously received SDTC funds, and I promptly did so. Any conflicts after joining, either real or perceived, were also disclosed. Finally, I've not had access to any files related to those conflicts, and I've recused myself from any decision-making. With regard payments during COVID to SDTC companies, I'd like to share my perspective as well. At my first board meeting, 2 weeks after being appointed, a recommendation came forward to give management discretion within an allotted pool of capital to make assistance payments if required. No individual companies were listed in the board documents. I'm willing to table a copy of that document to show you what the board received if required. There was also legal advice given to directors at that meeting that if they had previously declared conflicts, they did not have to redeclare. And I had declared mine 2 weeks prior. Finally, I have not received $1 from any company that has received SDTC funds, and none of the companies I'm invested in have exited or provided any return to me. I've not been compensated in any way by these companies or other organizations I'm affiliated with. I've received no payment, no dividend, and no remuneration at all. In fact, my partners and I have contributed significant personal time and financial resources to keep these companies and other non-clean tech companies contributing to the Canadian economy over these last few very challenging years. In closing, in my experience, the team at SDTC has been professional and delivered results. And while no individual organization is perfect, and we should always strive to improve, I'm very proud of the SDTC team and the work I've done on this board. I'm happy to take your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Kukucha.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kukucha. We will now go to Mr. Ouimet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee members for welcoming me today. My name is Guy Ouimet. I am originally from Montreal, and I still live there. I'm an industrial engineer. I graduated from the École Polytechnique at the University of Montreal. I hold an MBA from McGill University, and I'm certified by the Institute of Corporate Directors. After starting my career with multinationals, I quickly moved towards a role as an industrial investment professional, having worked most of my career in the fields of venture capital, private placement, project financing, and mergers and acquisitions. In this capacity, I acted as a senior executive for the Société Générale du Financement du Québec for 10 years. This practice, my private practice, has developed over the years based on my multi-sector and technological expertise, particularly in the fields of energy, metals and minerals, chemicals and petrochemicals, the automotive industry, and the evolution of these sectors toward the decarbonization of the economy. I've had institutional and government funds as clients, as well as numerous private companies. For 25 years, I participated in the setting up of multiple investment projects and transactions. Among other things, I acted as an external advisor for SDTC between 2006 and 2014. My combined expertise in multi-sector venture capital and the setting up of large-scale projects with regards to next-gen biofuels, for which $500 million was allocated to STDC in 2007. Since 2020, I've been exclusively a corporate director and act on 6 boards of directors and various committees, having taken a distance of 4 years from STDC and a new management being in place. I joined the SDTC Board of Directors in 2018, following an appointment resulting for my application through a recruitment process conducted by the Governor-in-General in over a year. Having no political affiliation and having requested no references except those required by the procedures during the process, I have declared all my background and skills, including my previous role as an advisor to the SDTC. In addition to being a member of the Board of Directors, I'm a member of the Project Review Committee and the Governance and Nominations Committee. Appointments to committees were subject to the approval of the chair of the board, who was Mr. Jim Balsillie. During the Governor-in-Council recruitment process, I declared a conflict of interest with a company that I had advised and which had been approved for SDTC funding prior to my appointment. I discussed the conflict of interest with Mr. Gary Lunn, then chair of the SDTC Board Governance Committee. He advised me, and I subsequently followed his recommendations as required. Since my appointment to the board, I have periodically declared all real, apparent, and potential conflict, and I have not had access to the files in question and have recused myself from any decision regarding the emergency COVID-19 payment to businesses As already indicated, the SDTC board referred to the Osler legal opinion, which was based on the prior declaration of conflicts of interest, the urgency of the situation, and the universal nature of the measure for which no company benefited from individual treatment. Like the rest of the board directors, I acted in good faith in accordance with this opinion. SDTC's mission appeals to me in the sense that it is absolutely relevant for the conversion of the Canadian economy towards decarbonization, as demonstrated by its track record over more than 20 years. The relevance and effectiveness of SDTC has been recognized on several occasions through periodic performance audits. Furthermore, clean tech entrepreneurs praised its contribution, and venture capitalists consider an SDTC contribution as prior validation of their own investment. These facts are well known in the industry across Canada. When joining the board, I noted the quality of SDTC's governance as well as the stature and reputation of my fellow directors. As a finance professional and corporate director, this is an essential prerequisite that I have always applied before joining each of the 21 boards of directors on which I have participated in my career. I'm available to answer your questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Ouimet. Mr. Perkins, you have 6 minutes.
Chair, and thank you, witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Lafon, for clarifying that opening statement and the relationships you have. My questions initially would be to Mr. Kakucha. Am I pronouncing your name right, Kakucha?
You are, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Kakucha, you said you joined in February 2021. What is your relationship with the company Semios, if I'm pronouncing that right?
As part of my work with Packbridge Partners, we did due diligence on Semios to see if we wanted to invest, and we did not invest. That's the extent of my relationship.
Packbridge is a venture capital firm.
It's a private equity venture capital firm.
Right. And your relationship with Terramera?
In 2016, 5 years, well, more than 5 years, but 5 years before I joined, I made a very small investment because I knew the CEO. That's the extent.
Miraterra Technologies.
That I believe Terramera and Miraterra are the same company, or they just split. My recollection is.
So Terramera, I believe, received about $500,000 in special COVID relief before you joined the board, and after you joined the board, another $349,000 in COVID relief.
Just 1 second, Mr. Kakucha, before you answer. Can you get your boom of your microphone up a little bit?
Sorry.
I think that should be better.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, you can go ahead. You can answer to the question by Mr. Perkins, or I don't know, Mr. Perkins, if you want to repeat.
Then that Terramera, which you have an interest in, received, I got to get it right, make sure I've got Terramera right, $141,000 before you were on the board in special COVID relief payments, and another $349,000 after you joined the board.
That seems to make sense. Like I said, sir, I invested $15,000 in 2016 as a favor to the CEO. And I'm a passive investor. I don't track the company. And when those COVID payments were made, as I declared Terramera as a conflict when I joined, because I had a small investment in them. And as I've previously stated, we had legal advice, and I had just declared the conflicts 2 weeks prior to my joining. So.
Whatsoever in Semios?
I have no interest in Semios whatsoever, sir. We did due diligence to consider investing, but we chose not to invest, and I believe that was also prior to my joining the board.
Terramera got $500,000 of COVID relief, some before and some after you joined the board. In terms of Terramera, Terramera received, I believe, after you joined the board, announcements from SDTC of funding of in March 30th, 2021, of almost $8 million, and received about $4.5 million before you on the board from SDTC. Is that correct?
I honestly don't know. I'll have to take you at your word, sir. Like I said, I made that investment 5 years before I even joined the board, and it's such a small investment on my part. I don't track it. I don't I don't follow it regularly, and I hope the company succeeds, as I'm sure every Canadian would, considering SDTC.
What's your interest in Intelligent City Inc.?
I have no personal interest in it whatsoever. I'm a senior advisor to a small mid-level investment bank in Vancouver called Fort Capital. And Fort Capital, prior to my joining Fort and prior to my joining the board, raised money for Intelligent City. So I felt the need to declare it because the firm I was attached to had previously raised capital for them.
So while you were on the board and some of the other board members on the special COVID committee, were you aware that when you were voting for the COVID relief money, that your fellow board member, her companies that she has a private equity venture capital interest in, received $1.4 million in COVID relief?
I was not presented when I, like I stated, sir, I joined the board 2 weeks prior to the second COVID vote, I believe. And I had declared all my conflicts, and we had received legal advice.
I understand that. So you weren't aware that other board members were receiving money. In her case, one of her companies was getting 10%, not the 5% that Annette Fasharian said.
I can't speak to those facts, sir. I have no knowledge.
At Fasharian's companies were receiving almost $300,000 in COVID relief payments, the chair of the board, when she moved the motion.
Again, sir, I can't speak to those facts. I'll have to take your word for it.
So you were totally unaware of anyone else's conflict of interest when they were voting for money for their own companies?
On the second board vote, we were advised by lawyers that we did not have to redeclare. So considering I was not at the first board vote, I would not have had knowledge of that.
I think under the ICD rules of real and perceived conflicts of interest that you were in a conflict of interest when you joined the board because you had an investment in companies that had already had a relationship with SDTC?
When I joined the board, sir, I was asked to resign from the board of one company that had received funding, and I promptly did that. And then on February 5th, when I joined the board, I declared 5 conflicts, 2 of which I had investments, 3 of which I had investments in. Yes, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perkins. Your time is up. So Mr. Turnbull has 6 minutes now.
Thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Umet, I hope I said it right. I'm going to ask you a quick question. I understand that we've heard from other witnesses that were former board members at SDTC that recusals on the board for real or perceived conflicts of interest were fairly regular practice. But what I want to know is, were they documented? Because I think there's some confusion as to, or even discrepancy as to whether it was adequately documented. From your perspective, were recusals regularly documented?
Thank you for that question. The processes for conflict of interest management were rigorously followed. I would like to point out that the 2001 founding statutes required that the board of directors have people that were actively involved in clean tech. So since the beginning, there have been very clear practices to manage conflict of interest. And every time a package is going to be provided, then everyone is asked to declare, to have all of their conflict of interest information examined, and then people recuse themselves so that they don't receive the material. So every time there is a decision to be made, then any conflicts of interest are taken note of. And from what I understand, in some cases, perhaps somebody was not indicated as having left the room and come back at a certain time. But everyone knows that the person recused himself or herself. So I have been involved since 2018, but I have been involved since 2006 in another role, and I certainly saw people for those generations of board of directors recuse themselves.
Recusals were regular practice, but perhaps at times were not documented as well as they should be. I think we've heard that. Would you just agree with that, that perhaps they weren't documented as regularly as they should be?
Yes, the administrative recommendations that came up in the recent report certainly do indicate that, and it's probably true.
In your case, you mentioned a specific instance with the Makers Lodge, I think, in the SIT leadership, and the decision that you recused yourself from, which is great to hear. Was that documented? Do you know that that was documented?
Yes, it was.
Okay, great. Would you be able to table that to the committee?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much. That'd be great. Mr. Kikucha, I'm going to go to you now. You said you were the recipient of the whistleblower call, which I think is important for us to dig into. You said that they did not submit any evidence, even though you requested, it sounded like you had requested evidence. And you had also said in your opening testimony that you felt the board fulfilled its fiduciary responsibilities with regards to those complaints that came in. Can you describe what process you followed in a little bit more detail to give us that assurance that, you know, because I want to know how you can make the claim that the board filled its fiduciary responsibility.
Sure, absolutely, sir. Thank you. I'm just looking at my notes because I have a timeline here. I received the call on January 27th. Immediately consulted with some board members on the governance committee. We formed a special committee on February 1st. We referred that and hired counsel on the 3rd and started work on that as early as February 10th. So our goal was to make this a priority and address this immediately because there were serious allegations that were outlined by the whistleblower. So after that, there was a rigorous investigation by the Special Investigatory Council we hired to look into this. They put in 23 hours worth of interviews and over 1 to 3 sessions for the number of people they talked to. They reviewed over 13,000 documents and worked with the special committee to answer the questions that were raised to me. And it appears now we didn't have all the facts because of the dossier. It's raised with me that the mandate we provided the council.
Okay, thank you. With regard to the COVID support decision-making that the board had done, you had mentioned that that was the second decision and that's just before you joined the board where you declared your conflicts of interest just prior to that decision. I understand that from reading documents and hearing other testimony that decision was made based on a whole portfolio of companies that where no company was actually disclosed in the motion that the board voted on. Is that true?
That's correct, sir. Yes.
Okay, and is that why the legal advice that you received said that there was no perceived conflict of interest? Because I think that this is a very important point. Because that's what we've heard from numerous witnesses, that there was no perceived conflict of interest because, in fact, you were approving a whole portfolio with a flat amount or a percentage, I think. I'm not sure which, but maybe you can just clarify that.
My recollection was it was a pool of capital that management had the discretion to make more investments in up to a certain percentage, but I honestly don't know the specifics, sir. It's been a while. But from a legal perspective, that was my understanding, certainly, that those conflicts had been declared and we did not have to redeclare again.
Okay, just very quickly, would you be able to table the document that you had offered? You offered two documents that you, in your opening testimony, that you could table with this committee. Would you be able to table those? One was that no companies were disclosed. So I think that the document that actually demonstrates that would be helpful. And then I think you had mentioned another one. I had it in my notes, but if you could also table the other document that you had mentioned.
Certainly, sir. I'll ask SDTC to table the director's motion. And we received a partial transcript from the phone call that the whistleblower taped. So I'd happily be open if the whistleblower wanted to disclose the whole tape. I'm very comfortable with my conduct. I offered a safe space for that individual to testify and let him know that we were going to take these allegations very seriously and action them immediately.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lemire.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ouellet, I'll begin with you. You are a board director, and I'm sure that your reputation is what is most important to you. You talked about the context earlier. The way things worked in DTC, of course, there would be conflicts of interest. The level of expertise around the table, does that obviously it requires people that understand clean tech and understand the green economy and the emerging technologies. That requires quite advanced knowledge. So could directors be anyone other than those who come from the sector? Well, originally in 2001, the SDTC had a much more limited mandate. That was decontamination and so on. But now things have become more complex because clean tech companies are involved in almost all aspects of the economy. They work in the U.S. and around the world. So a lot of in-depth knowledge from various sectors are required on the board of directors. So taxation and all sorts of other expertise is needed, as well as the technological understanding. So there are, you need people who know the sector, the development and startups and scale-ups. So all these are all different important aspects. So to have a board, you need that set of expertise. Well, when you look at which companies would be good to invest in, the federal government probably has a lot of knowledge of oil and gas, but less in this area. We need to have these companies become more profitable in Quebec and Canada. So if you have a board of directors with experts, you need a proper process. Well, I certainly can't evaluate the expertise of the federal government, but the federal government in 2001 decided to create the SDTC, to give it a mandate and a governance format. So it was the government that created the SDTC. So Petro-Canada, for example, their green tech aspect was created. At the beginning, it was a startup, but now we have clean tech many people across the country want that logo. But you were appointed in 2018? Yes, I was appointed in 2018, and my mandate was extended by a year. I would like to hear from you, given the allegations and the investigation. The SDTC is not awarding any new money. How many new projects would have been accepted? So normally, what would you have expected the number of investments to be? I don't have a specific number, but usually 175 to 200 million dollars is given out by the SDTC to quite a number of companies. So 7 or 8 projects might come before the investment committee. So that's quite a lot when you add that up. 6 meetings a year, that makes for dozens of investments. And then there are other companies that are already underway. They need to go from phase 1 to phase 2, for example. And then there are some that don't move forward, of course. So there's a serious risk that the clean tech ecosystem will be damaged because of what is going on today. It's unfortunate that the investment is suspended. But right now, the minister is at COP with oil companies. Well, I can't make any comment on the minister's activities. Well, that's a good idea. So will this potentially have a long-term impact on the SDTC? At this point, there have been reports on the allegations, and all of the reports so far show that there is no basis for these allegations. There have been recommendations for administrative improvements that have been provided in the report to the minister on December 1st. There's the management plan that's been submitted, and so the minister will be able to see that the improvements have been made, and then investments can get underway, we hope. Thank you. Mr. Massey.
Chair. Mr. LaFond, to start with you in terms of maybe walk us through the process of declaring a conflict of interest in the boardroom there. Walk us through in terms of what happens. How does that go about? Do you just basically say that, leave the room, come back in? Just maybe walk us through that experience.
2015, 2016, 2017, when we really began to realize that our organization was really beginning to respond to the marketplace. In other words, we were responding to what was given to us in our obligations through our statutory requirements through the Order in Council. We recognized that we were stepping into a much higher risk profile with high-risk profile companies. So we had to change our conflict of interest to keep in pace. We also recognized we had to recognize the types of risk we were now moving into. So we actually really began to deal with conflict of interest by getting good advice from, I believe, KPMG to give us an example as to what was happening inside IP, what was happening inside of AI, what was happening in data, and how we had to make sure we protected those because... So basically what would happen is we would get the list. We would get the list as a board member in advance of a meeting saying, here are the lists, here are the companies we're about to receive and make a decision on at the next board meeting. Please declare any perceived or clear conflict of interest. It would be a profile from left to right. This is what the amount is. These are the actors, whether it's a VP. These are the other investors inside of it, and this is what this in what sector, whether it's in the tech sector or whether it's in the oil and gas sector. This is what it's intended to do. So then we would respond back and say, I have a conflict, and then when the discussion comes through inside the board discussion, people then say there's a conflict. I recuse myself and leave the room.
Okay, and when you get that package, does it include all the information of where you might have a conflict of interest, or do you get a pre-package that would list all the potential decisions of the investments and not have information? Or do you get the full package that could involve some of the information that you might be in a conflict with?
No, we don't get, like I said, left to right, usually it's the amount, people involved, and in what sector, and what is their, again, if it's oil and gas, are they doing something with water treatment, or is it hydro? Are they doing new modular thinking regarding, using a technology that allows them to be more cost saving? So then you'd say, I don't know anybody on the board or any of the investors. I'm not involved in this sector. And then you really kind of take a look and say, what's the value of this? And then you basically say,
so you wouldn't have any information about what the case would be, and then they would send subsequent information about all those investments. So you would get two packages.
That's right.
One. Okay. So thank you for that. And on the board, and the culture of the board is what I'm trying to understand a little bit about. Were there board members that would, personally outside of the boardroom know each other professionally, perhaps, in co-ownership or joint co-ownership of other companies? And lastly, even on other boards, are social circles? Was it common on the time that you were there to have mixed experiences with other board members?
For me?
Yeah, just in your
zero. I had zero awareness of any other board member in this area and in the regions across Canada. You got to remember, I come from a very specific community, and as I said, there was almost no involvement inside the clean tech industry. If it was an oil and gas industry, sure, I know a lot of people in the oil and gas industry. If there was people in the potash company, I knew what was going on. But in the clean tech, I had no involvement with anybody else on the board. It was all new to me.
Okay, so thank you. No, that's helpful. Mr. Kukucha, how about you? What's your experience of the boards that you've been there for a while, and that is the board members? Do they socialize together? Do they sit on joint ventures together? Do they sit on other boards together? What's the environment? And second to that, is there any rules about board members talking about the contents of the meeting prior to the meeting? Is that not restricted?
I've sat on a lot of boards, both in the United States and Canada, and this is one of the most professional boards I've sat on, and the level of quality of people that sit on it is impressive. Because of that level of professionalism, there was not one conversation I had outside of the boardroom referring to any of the projects, or there's no co-investment, there's no relationships that extend beyond that. Social occasions tend to be about social occasions and whatever activities people are up to. But I've never, ever seen a discussion, and I've never had one myself related to anything regarding investment or the projects.
Okay, but then I guess that, there were social times that board members would be together as well, too?
Periodically, we'd have a dinner, or most of those dinners were filled with, we'd have expert speakers come in or people come in to talk about government programs. Even the board dinners were largely working, and conversations in the hallway or a drink afterwards were largely related to sort of what we're doing as an organization.
Yeah, so there were those things happening. I mean, listen, I come from an era where a lot of decisions about other people were made on golf courses, and so I'm just trying to get a picture here as to, kind of, because I mean, you must be a little bit concerned about and I appreciate it, and it would be helpful if you table the whistleblowers' information. How does it, obviously the minister has suspended things right now. These things don't happen in a vacuum. What do you think, I guess, was really missed in this process? I mean, there's right now a professional body that's been engaged to try to allow whistleblowers to come forward, and some are still concerned. You've been there for a while. What do you think is, if everything was so good as Mr. Ouellette says, why are we here?
A brief answer.
All I can state for is that the meetings we have, there's rigorous discussion. Oftentimes, the terms of the funding get changed in those meetings, but we operate as a consensus organization when it goes to a vote. But the board members are very much engaged, very much focused on the cause. Not being on the People and Culture Committee, obviously, if there were issues, some of that did not filter up to the board or to myself. But this is one of the better run organizations I've ever been a part of, and it's incredibly professional and it's very results driven. So I can't say much more than that, sir.
Thank you very much. I'll now yield the floor to MP Barrett for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Ouimet, how long have you been on the board for SDTC?
Since depuis le 8 Novembre.
November 8th, 2018.
Order in council?
What?
How many
Yes.
stakes in have received taxpayer money from SDTC?
Une.
One.
Did you vote to give your own companies taxpayer money?
Premièrement, je n'ai.
Well, to begin with, I don't have a company. I am not a company owner.
Precision then, sir. How many companies that you have an interest in have received money from SDTC?
I'll repeat my réponse.
I'll repeat one company.
To give these companies that you have an interest in taxpayer money?
Si vous avez bien compris la logistique de la.
Well, if you understood how the COVID payments worked, the answer is yes, because the conflict of interest were managed.
So let me lay this out. One of the companies that you have an interest in is called Lithion. Is that correct?
Oui.
Okay, and you answered yes. I'm not sure if that was audible. We heard about how rigorous the conflict of interest rules have been followed at the company, and I want to go over that with you. In front of me, I have meeting minutes from the Monday, March 23rd, 2020 meeting, where a COVID payment for Lithion of $192,100 was paid, and one for, and you've agreed yes, and Tuesday, March 9th, 2021, where that company you have an interest in received $201,705. So one payment of $192,000, one payment of $201,000. You voted to award that to both of those companies. Now, in attendance at both of those meetings, your name is listed. Were you in attendance at those meetings, sir? Just a yes or no?
Oui.
Yes.
I see that noted on the minutes are regrets. You're not included in regrets. I'm going to turn the document over, and it says that the decision was unanimous on that item. And the same is true for that was on the 2020 item. The same is true for 2021. So it's unanimous. There's no indication that there was a recusal made. And in further items, it goes on to actually detail when someone leaves the room. So it talks about how the CEO left for an in-camera item, which, of course, we can infer from that you didn't leave the room for the decision on the COVID payments. Is that correct?
Oui.
So
yes,
in both cases, to award the money to the company that you have an interest in. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
Do you see how it could be perceived as a problem for taxpayers that you're there as a government appointee and then you vote to give a company that you have an interest in hundreds of thousands of dollars? Do you see how that's a problem?
Je peux répondre?
May I answer? The problem was identified in advance because, as I've said, we had a situation where there was $20 million for emergency COVID support, and a program was set up for universal support. We all declared conflicts of interest, or not everyone, but not all directors are in conflict of interest all the time. I don't want to give that impression. So immediately management was asked how to administer this program, and the decision was made to add 5% to their existing investment, and we followed the legal opinion.
Was a percentage amount, but sir, there's no way that reasonable people would find that these are reasonable actions. It's unbelievable that we have hundreds of thousands of dollars being paid. The money is being. We have a government appointee taking taxpayer dollars and then giving it to their own company that they have an interest in because other people who are also implicated, like the chair of the board, have said, this kind of behavior is okay. To say that this is a company or an organization that has rigorous ethical standards that have been followed is absolutely egregious. We saw in the report that the government commissioned that the ethics advisor advised people to backdate their ethics filings. Sir, this is not just problematic. This kind of insider dealing and corruption is very problematic for Canadians. And sir, we'll have more questions about that. I think I'm out of time.
You are indeed, Mr. Barrett. I'll now yield the floor to Mr. Sorbara.
Oh, yes, they turned it on. That's right. Thank you, MP. Afternoon, gentlemen, and welcome. I want to turn my attention to a couple things. First off, the role of SDTC as a incubator, as an investor in clean tech in Canada. First, if I can go over to you, George, how important is that role?
A very critical role in terms of where we placed it inside the value chain. When we recognized, as I said, when we started realizing that clean tech definition was changing dramatically, when we began this journey as a country, it even goes way back to when I was on the National Roundtable for Environment and Economy, we were really looking at the hydrocarbon issue, and that's why when you take a look at the funds that we had that were initially allocated, it was about biofuels. Okay. We recognized, as I said, in about 2015, 2016, there was a change in how you would define clean tech, because then you had to overlay IP, you had to overlay data, you had to overlay AI. So we recognized that we had to keep up with where the market was going.
And I would add that the traditional metrics of your football field valuation, I was an investment banker at one time in my life, in my 20s, and a pretty unique experience. The traditional metrics when you're evaluation a company don't really apply when you're looking at early stage entities.
That's right.
And I'm going to put this question to George and Stephen, if I remember, and even Guy, if he wants to chime in. Yeah. In terms of the approval process, when you were submitted project ideas or ideas for investment, there must have been some sort of governance process that you would go through on normal times. In your view, and all three of you gentlemen are very experienced in this area, how robust was that governance process that you would be looking at or utilizing in analyzing the project ideas? And George, then Stephen, then Guy, if you can keep it quick.
I remember receiving a briefing note that talked about where we were going to start positioning SDTC, which was in the high-risk area. That when we basically looked at all of the, what I call silos, whether it was the type of research that's required for technology or whatever. And when we take a look at, as you know, and if you said you're a corporate banker, I mean, when you start doing startups, you're really looking at the capital costs. You're looking at the tangible assets, like a factory in Saskatchewan, $200 million for a canola crushing plant. What entrepreneur has that? So basically, you're looking at banks, you're looking at investors, whatever it may be. We recognized we had to be even on top of that tier. When you start talking about the types of loans or the types of grants, soft loans, whatever it may be, we knew that we had to be the point of these issues surrounding the new way in which we had to help fund and support startup or scaling up. So I would say to you, the rigor was there, because in many ways, when you see how some of the projects that were in startup then moved to scale up, it kind of told me that we were really graduating companies. We're putting bets on companies that really were saying what they were going to do.
If we can go to Stephen online, Stephen, please.
Sure. I've seen and done a lot of due diligence in my day, and the materials that come from this group are first class. They are top notch. To the point that this organization, over its 20 years history, has invested about $1.7 billion into companies, and that's leveraged about $13 billion. And that only happens if the due diligence and the efforts of the organization puts in is respected and viewed by external investors as something that's impeccable. So as a member of the project review committee, I'll receive 1,000, 1,200 pages to read prior to a meeting a week before, and it is detailed. So I'm very confident with what the work product that this group and team puts out.
And Stephen, you mentioned earlier that you recused yourself on occasions where you needed to, and that was the policy that was put in place. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir, yes.
Okay. And to Guy, if you wanted to comment on what I've asked the other two gentlemen, s'il vous plaît.
Is it about due diligence or?
The due diligence and the recusal.
Okay. Le processus de.
Well, the due diligence process, as has been said, was very robust. It was assessed, rather for project assessment, as DTC approved projects with various partners. And over the past few years, SDTC had to invest in companies rather than projects because companies can create more value. So those changes had to be made. And so there was a broader approach, not just for technology. And so we developed a very robust process for doing that.
Monsieur Sorbara, Monsieur Lemire.
That's all the time you have, Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ouimet, I would like to continue with you. The oil industry creates, what, $200 billion in profits, from what we understand? And TVA mentioned this week, and it came up in the House, there were 2,000 meetings with the Liberals. There's an average of 3 a day with Liberals at various levels. So when you look at the Conservatives and Liberals, all that interaction, don't you think that's a conflict of interest that could be brought up? Well, that's a good question. But I'm not here to talk politics. It's not the context that I work in. I'm a director. But to talk about the role of parties and lobbyists, the oil industry, that's a bit sensitive for me because I'm not part of that sector. But there are always lobbyists in any industry. And certainly in the oil industry, that's the case. Do you think that that can have an influence on the types of priorities that certain parties might have or certain questions that might be asked of witnesses about their corporate or other interests? Can we have the development of clean tech and all the benefits from it? Could some people see that as a threat to the traditional energy interests? Do you think that questions might come from that angle? Well, I wouldn't answer that question specifically, but I would say that fighting climate change through clean technologies isn't a threat to the oil industry because it's going to be there for a long time. There are always ways like carbon capture that can help the oil industry work more cleanly. The debate is underway on various of these approaches, but even though people now work on computers, it doesn't mean that there are fewer jobs. Things change. So decarbonization in general will be good for everyone because there were. Thank you. That's all the time I had. Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
Mr. Massé, the floor is yours for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Back to Mr. Kukucha. You've heard the testimony this afternoon or this early evening about, basically board members now voting, for interests with regards to their own, companies. And do you still have, this is the highest model of how it operates? We've just heard testimony that people with a conflict of interest voted in favor of projects where they're tied to. Is this? I mean, is this regular practice then? And is this the part? Or do you want to correct the record in terms of you would expect this to take place in other boards?
Absolutely not, and it certainly wasn't regular practice. I know that the RCGT report pointed out some documenting issues, and I think some of the minutes and documents may not accurately reflect. I can't speak to all of them in specificity, but I know for a fact that when directors had a conflict, the process that George discussed was exactly what happens. You declared the conflict, you did it before you received materials, you left the room, and maybe in the instance of the COVID payment, the second one, I can't speak to the first one, there was an instance where some people, including myself, had an interest, but there was no list of companies that came forward to us. So to this date, to be honest, I didn't even know that the companies that I had declared a conflict had received funds.
We just heard from this panel here, one of our panelists, Mr. Ouellette, has suggested that he was in the room and had voted for money going to a company that he had financial interests with.
The proper procedure and the procedure that was always followed was directors either physically or virtually left the room, and that's my recollection of what always happened at meetings.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Massé.
Thank you very much, Mr. Namir. I want to thank our witnesses, thank our interpreters, the support staff, analysts, our clerk. Go in peace. The meeting is adjourned.